The fog was a shroud, clinging cold and damp to everything in Copper Willow Basin. It was early spring in the Wyoming Territory, 1887, and the world was bleached of color, reduced to shades of gray and frozen white. Frost lay thick on the dead grass, a brittle crust that crunched like salt under the hooves of Sutton Hale's roan gelding. The air was so still, so cold, it felt thin in the lungs. The horse blew out a plume of steam, and the moisture crystallized instantly on its whiskers. Sutton Hale rode with the steady, patient posture of a man accustomed to long hours in the saddle. He was 32 years old, but the war had aged him in ways the years had not, a thin, white scar, a souvenir from a cavalry saber at Trevilian Station, cut a sharp line from the corner of his jaw to his chin. It was the only part of his face that didn't feel the cold. He wore a gray wool coat, buttoned high against the chill, its fibers tight and repellent against the mist. He was a man built of straight lines and hard angles, his face set in the neutral mask of a man doing a job he neither loved nor hated. It was simply the job. Inside that coat, tucked into an inner pocket, was the physical manifestation of that job. It was a folded document, stiff with legal ink and the seal of Harrow County. Transfer deed number 4187. The words were etched in his memory. They represented 160 acres of land, bought and paid for at a bank foreclosure sale by the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate. His employers, Sutton was not a land grabber, not in the way some were. He was, in the cold language of the syndicate's Denver office, a facilitator, a closer. He was the man they sent when the letters had been ignored and the notices torn down. He was the one who rode out to put a face to the signature, to translate the legal language into the hard, simple reality of eviction. He had ridden out from Larkspur Crossing before dawn, the small settlement already 2 hours behind him, nothing but a smudge of lamplight in the oppressive dark. Now, the basin opened up, a vast, shallow bowl of frosted prairie. He followed the faint indentation of a wagon track, his eyes scanning the landscape. He wasn't looking for beauty, but for boundaries. His mind was a map of quadrants, survey lines, and legal descriptions. 160 acres, running north from Sparrow Run Creek to the base of Red Lark Ridge. And then he saw it. First, the fence line. It was less a barrier and more a suggestion. A line of leaning, silvered posts and sagging wire that looked as tired as the land itself. It was a scar of human effort, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Beyond it, tucked against the steep incline of the ridge, was the cabin. It was small, built of logs that had long since surrendered their color to the weather. The structure seemed to hunker down, pressing itself into the earth as if trying to escape the vast, indifferent sky. A crooked stovepipe, rusted and leaning, released a thin, almost invisible ribbon of smoke. It was a fragile sign of life, a desperate gray prayer against the overwhelming cold. Sutton reined in his horse, the animal sensing the end of the journey and dropping its head. He sat for a long moment, taking it all in. The broken gate, the half-collapsed shed, its roof caved in by a winter's worth of snow, a rusted plowshare lying discarded near the woodpile, its metal weeping orange onto the frosted ground. This was not a thriving homestead. This was a place clinging on by its fingernails. He felt the familiar dull ache of the task ahead. It was always the same. There would be shouting or tears or a stunned, broken silence. He preferred the shouting. It was cleaner. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp, cold earth. The jingle of his spurs was an intrusion, a sharp, metallic sound in the profound quiet. He tied the roan to a fence post that wobbled under the horse's weight. His hand went instinctively to his coat, his fingers brushing the stiff paper of the deed, 4187. As he moved toward the cabin, the heavy wooden door creaked open. A figure emerged, and for a moment, Sutton thought it was a boy. The figure was slight, wrapped in a man's oversized canvas coat, and moved with a quick, wiry energy, heading not for Sutton, but for a loose rail on the nearby corral. Then the figure stopped, freezing in place. The sound of Sutton's boots on the hard-packed earth had finally cut through the fog. The figure turned slowly, The mist, which had been a solid wall, chose that moment to thin, swirling and parting like a theater curtain. It wasn't a boy. It was a woman. Alara Quinn, 25 years old, according to the papers. But the basin had been hard on her. She was thin, her form lost in the patched canvas dress and the heavy coat. But it was a wiry thinness, a toughness born of necessity. Her face was pale from the cold, her cheekbones sharp, but it was her eyes that held him. They were a smoky, hollowed-out blue, rimmed with a faint redness that spoke of a long night spent crying. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and the sorrow, there was a defiant, flinty core. She was not broken. She was just, Sutton thought, terribly bent. Her hands, clutching a hammer, told their own story. They were wrapped in strips of what looked like old linen, makeshift bandages stained dark with pine resin and dirt. The knuckles visible were raw and chapped, thick brown hair, rich and out of place in this landscape of gray, was pulled back in a loose, functional bun. Stray strands clinging to her damp temples. She said nothing. She just watched him, the hammer held loosely at her side. She had seen men like him before, men who rode in with a purpose that had nothing to do with the people who lived on the land. Sutton stopped a dozen yards from her. He took off his hat, a gesture of habit rather than courtesy. The cold air hit his hair. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was deep, steady, the voice of authority. "I'm looking for Mr. Ephraim Quinn. Is he the owner of this parcel?" Alara Quinn's gaze did not waver. She seemed to look right through him, at the syndicate, at the bank, at the entire system that had sent him. Her lips parted, and her voice was so low it was almost stolen by the fog. Used to be. It was just 3 words, but they landed with a terrible weight. Sutton felt his practiced speech die in his throat. This was the part he hated, the part where hope officially expired. She looked down at the muddy ground between them, then back up at him. Her throat worked. "Please," she whispered, and the word cracked. "Spare my father." Sutton's hand, which had been moving toward his coat pocket, stopped. He had heard pleading before. He had heard it all, but this was different. This was not a plea for time or for mercy. It was a plea for a life. Alara took a step toward him. The mud of the yard, thick and greedy, sucked at her worn boot, making a small, wet sound. She took another step. Her eyes locked on his. "He's all I have," she said, her voice stronger now, sharpened by a desperate, jagged edge. "The land, it's just dirt. But it's his dirt. It's all that's left of my mother, of everything." Sutton remained silent. He was a wall. He had to be. "Ma'am, the bank is already foreclosed. The land was sold at public auction. I'm just here to deliver the final transfer papers. The syndicate takes possession at noon tomorrow." "Noon." She repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. She looked past him, at the unforgiving, empty basin. Then she looked back at him, and her eyes changed. The defiance flared, pushing past the despair. "You're a man," she said. It was an accusation and a statement of fact. "You work for them. They pay you." "I have a job to do, ma'am," Sutton said, his voice hardening slightly. "Then do it," she said, her voice dropping again, becoming thick and raw. She took one more step, closing the distance between them until he could see the faint tremor in her chin. "Take me instead." The words hung in the frozen air, sharp and unbelievable. Sutton Hale, a man who had faced cannon fire and charged a fortified line, froze. His breath hitched. His horse, sensing the sudden, terrible tension, shifted and rattled its bit. The sound was obscenely loud in the silence. "What did you say?" he asked, though he had heard her perfectly. "You're a man," she repeated, her voice shaking but her gaze unwavering. "You have needs. The men at the syndicate, they're just men." She was pale, but a dark, painful flush was creeping up her neck. She was disgusted with herself, and with him, but she pushed on. "I'll go with you. I'll be whatever you need. I'll cook. I'll clean. "Whatever you want. Just let him stay. Let him keep the cabin. He doesn't need all 160 acres. Just the cabin and the small pasture." She finished in a rush, the words tumbling out, and then she stood there, trembling, awaiting her sentence. Sutton's hand, which had been frozen near his pocket, moved. It moved away from the deed. He felt a cold sickness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He had seen the absolute worst of human nature, but this was a new, terrible kind of barter. A soul for a patch of dirt, as if on cue. A noise came from the cabin, a harsh, racking cough, deep and wet and brittle. At the same moment, the fire inside the cabin's small fireplace must have been stoked because it flared brightly. For a single second, the interior of the dark cabin was illuminated. Through the small, grime-covered window, Sutton saw a silhouette. It was an old man, thin as a rail, his body bowed. He was collapsing into a rickety wooden chair by the hearth, one hand clutching his chest as the cough shook his fragile frame. Ilara's eyes followed his. "His heart," she said, her voice flat. All the fight gone, replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion. "It's weak. The doctor in Larkspur said the cold is the worst thing. It makes it hard for him to breathe. Some nights I have to sit up and hold him, just to keep him warm enough to see the morning." She looked back at Sutton, her eyes now completely bare. All the pride, all the defiance, was gone. There was only the raw, desperate plea. "If you turn him out, he won't last a week. He will die. That's not the law. Mister, that's a different kind of crime." Sutton stood there, the cold fog swirling around his boots. The entire neat, orderly world of deeds and deadlines and syndicate business had just shattered. He was no longer an agent. He was a man standing in a muddy yard, being asked to trade a woman for an old man's life. He was a man of rules, and the rules had just broken. He couldn't accept her offer. It was monstrous. He couldn't do his job. It was just as monstrous. He took a step back, breaking the terrible intimacy of the moment. He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. He needed the shadow. He needed the barrier. I cannot accept that, ma'am." His voice was hoarse. He turned, his mind fumbling for procedure, for the script. "I will be back," he said, his voice finding its official, flat tone again. "I will be back in the morning. At noon, as instructed." He walked back to his horse, his steps heavy. He felt her eyes on his back, a physical weight. He untied the reins, his fingers clumsy in their leather gloves. He swung himself into the saddle, the familiar creak of the leather a small comfort. He gathered the reins, his own hands feeling heavy and useless. He clicked his tongue, and the roan, eager to move, to find warmth, turned. He did not look back. He couldn't. He rode away, the horse's hooves making that same lonely, crunching sound in the frost. He rode into the fog, and it closed behind him like a door. He was a dozen yards away, already a ghost in the mist. When her voice came to him, it was not a shout. It was a thread of sound, thin and sharp, that wove itself into the fog and followed him. Just spare him. Dawn did not so much arrive as it did conquer. It broke over the sharp, black spine of Redlark Ridge, spilling a hard, metallic gold across the gray valley. The light was thin, offering no warmth, only judgment. It exposed every flaw, every patch, every bit of decay in the Quinn homestead. Sutton Hale had not returned to Larkspur Crossing. He had spent the night in a cold camp down by the creek, his mind a turmoil of fog and a woman's whispered plea. Her words, "Take me instead," had lodged in him like a burr. He was a man who understood transactions, land for money, labor for wages. But this was a currency he did not trade in, and it had shaken him. He rode back not at noon, as he'd said, but just as the sun cleared the ridge. He would not give them the day to dread the knock. He would do this quickly. The law was the law. It was a cold comfort, but it was the only one he had. He dismounted and walked onto the rickety porch. The boards bowed under his weight. He did not knock. He stood there, the man from the bank, the agent of the syndicate, and pulled the folded document from his coat. He opened transfer deed number 4187. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the morning stillness, preparing to read the eviction notice to the empty door. The door creaked open. It was not Alara. It was the silhouette from the window. Ephraim Quinn. He was 58 years old, but the high plains and the sickness had carved him down to something ancient. He was painfully thin, his skin the color of dried tobacco, stretched tight over the sharp bones of his face. He leaned heavily on a hickory walking stick, his knuckles white, his hands, Sutton saw, trembled with a fine, constant tremor, a palsy that was part age, part sickness, part sheer, distilled rage. He wore flannel underwear, gray with use, and a pair of trousers held up by a single suspender. But his eyes were not old or sick. They were a piercing, crystalline gray, sharp as shattered creek ice. They were the eyes of a man who had not yet surrendered, even if his body had. "You're the man from the bank," Ephraim stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a dry rattle, like stones in a gourd. "Sutton Hale. I'm acting as agent for the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate," Sutton replied, his voice formal. He held the paper up, a shield between them. "Mr. Quinn, I am here to serve notice, as per the default on the promissory note dated October 5th, 1885. The mortgage held by the Harrow County Bank was foreclosed. The property was sold at public auction." Ephraim's eyes narrowed. "Sold?" "Yes, sir. To my employers. I hold the legal transfer of title, 160 acres. Sutton's gaze was fixed on the paper, reading the legal script. "This includes the primary dwelling, all outbuildings, and crucially all subsurface mineral rights." There it was. The reason? This wasn't about a failed farm. This was about what lay beneath it. Copper, silver. The rumor in Larkspur was that the Kincaid Syndicate wanted to tear the valley apart. Ephraim Quinn was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the whistling of his breath, a thin, reedy noise. The tremor in his hand worsened, and he gripped the stick until it seemed it might snap. He did not look at Sutton. He did not look at the paper. Instead, he lifted his weak arm and pointed with a single, trembling finger toward the northeast corner of the small yard, near the creek. "You see that tree?" he rasped. "The one with the white bark, the quaking aspen." Sutton followed his gaze. He saw a small, fenced-off rectangle of earth, a modest wooden cross, weathered to the same gray as the cabin, stood at its head. "My wife, Abigail, is buried there," Ephraim said, his voice dropping. "She died in the blizzard of '81. We came here with 2 mules and a handful of seed. She was the one who kept the ledger. She was the one who believed." He turned his head, and those sharp, gray eyes fixed on Sutton. "I read the papers. Mr. Hale, I know what they say. But your paper is just ink. That ground over there, that ground is 20 years of calluses. It's the sweat from my brow and the blood from my hands. It's the place I buried the woman who saw me through my first winter here, and the only child we managed to keep." He coughed, a deep, painful convulsion that bent him over his stick. "Your paper," he finished, spitting a small bit of phlegm onto the porch. "It don't have the right to bury her twice." At that moment, Alara came around the side of the cabin. She was carrying a heavy load of split pine, held together by a leather strap she wore over her shoulder like a guy. The load was too big for her, forcing her to lean forward, her muscles straining. She stopped when she saw the 2 men, her face pale and drawn in the morning light. Her eyes met Sutton's, and in them he saw the shame of the night before, and the defiant fear of the morning. Sutton saw her index finger, the one curled around the strap. It was coated in thick, amber-colored pine resin, the same sticky substance he'd seen smeared on her makeshift bandages yesterday. She had been doctoring the trees, or perhaps fixing a leaky roof, doing a man's work because the man of the house could not. She did not speak. She did not interfere in the business of men. She just stood there, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather strap, her breath coming in short, steamy puffs in the cold. Sutton looked away from her, back to the old man, and in that second, he truly saw the homestead. He was a cavalryman. He was a surveyor. He knew land, and this land was dying. The plow furrows in the small field to the south were crooked, uneven, the lines of a man plowing with one arm, or with a failing heart. The small windmill that should have been pulling water from Sparrow Run Creek was still, one of its blades shattered and hanging loose, a broken wing, and near the barn, their only horse, a thin bay mare, stood with its head down. As Sutton watched, it shifted its weight, and he saw it. The mare Juniper. The name on the chattel mortgage was Lame, a deep, painful limp in her left foreleg. It was a cascade of revelation, a quiet, terrible inventory. A sick man, a lame horse, a broken windmill. This wasn't poverty as a hardship. This was poverty as an absolute, an impossibility. These people weren't failing because they were lazy or proud. They were failing because the world had systematically broken every tool they had, including their own bodies. Ephraim was still breathing hard, his gaze fixed on the aspen grave. Ilara was frozen by the woodpile. Sutton Hale, the facilitator, the closer, folded the deed. The stiff paper crackled in protest. He slid it back into his coat pocket. "Mr. Quinn," he said, his voice flat, betraying nothing. "The law is the law, but it is not yet noon." He turned, walking off the porch, his spurs silent in the soft dirt. He did not go to his horse. He walked past it, heading for the boundary line he had studied on his map. He spent the day in the open. He walked the 160 acres. He walked the crooked fence line, noting where the posts were rotten. He knelt by Sparrow Run Creek and tasted the water. He saw the tracks of deer and the tracks of something bigger. A cougar. Maybe. He was staking his own claim on the problem, understanding its geography. He did not, he realized, work for the Kincaid Syndicate. Not really. He worked for the money. The money bought him solitude, and it kept the memories of the war at bay. But standing on Red Lark Ridge, looking down at the cabin that looked like a child's forgotten toy, he felt the old, familiar weight of command, the weight of responsibility. That night, he did not ride back to town. He made camp where the Quinn land met the state parcel, right on the survey line. He built a small, smokeless fire, a soldier's fire, and cooked a strip of bacon. He sat against his saddle, the heat of the small flames barely touching his shins, the vast, cold darkness of Wyoming pressing in on all sides. The stars were brilliant, hard points of ice. He heard her before he saw her, the faint crunch of a boot on the frosted grass. He didn't reach for his sidearm. He just watched the edge of the firelight. Ilara Quinn stepped into the small circle of orange light. She was not wearing the oversized coat. She wore her patched canvas dress, and a thick wool shawl was wrapped around her shoulders. In one hand, she carried an old tin coffee pot. In the other, a cloth-wrapped bundle. She did not look afraid. She looked resolved. "I saw your fire," she said. Her voice was quiet, respectful of the dark. "You shouldn't be out here. The nights are still cold enough to kill." She stepped closer and placed the items on a flat rock near the fire. "It's not much," she said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a small loaf of dark cornbread, studded with corn kernels. A faint wisp of steam rose from it. "But it's warm, and the coffee is hot." Sutton looked at the offering. It was likely half their provisions for the next day. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice rough. She did not leave. She stood on the other side of the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. The light caught the high planes of her cheekbones and the deep, hollowed shadows of her eyes. "He's asleep," she said. "The laudanum the doctor gave him. It lets him rest, but it makes him weak." Sutton nodded, pouring a cup of the coffee into his tin cup. It was black, bitter, and scalding hot. It was perfect. Ilara watched him. The silence stretched, filled only by the pop and hiss of the fire. "Yesterday," she said, her voice dropping. "I was desperate. I wasn't thinking. I spoke out of turn." Sutton looked up. There's no need to. I am thinking clearly now. Mr. Hale. She interrupted, her voice firm. It had the same icy edge as her father's. If you take this land, my father will die. The doctor in town confirmed it. His heart can't take the shock. It can't take the displacement. He will lie down in the wagon, and he will die before we reach Larkspur. That is a fact. Sutton looked into his coffee cup. The law doesn't account for that. But you do, she said. You're a man, not a piece of paper. She took a breath. I am making you a different offer. A business proposition. Sutton waited. You are an agent. You have power. You can delay. You can adjust the survey lines. You can do something. You know you can. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. If I go with you, when you leave this valley, I will be your housekeeper. I will be your ward. I will sign whatever paper you want. I will be indentured to you, for as long as you say. Her voice shook. Just once. In exchange, you use your power. You leave my father the upper shelf, the 10 acres by the ridge, just the cabin and the pasture, just enough for him to live out his days, enough for him to farm, this one last season. Sutton stopped, his hand halfway to the cornbread. This was worse. Yesterday was the desperate cry of a terrified girl. This was the cold, calculated negotiation of a woman at the end of her rope. She was offering him servitude. Miss Quinn, he said, his voice hard. I told you, I don't buy people. Ilara's chin came up. The firelight caught the glint of tears in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. I'm not asking to be bought, she said, her voice fierce and low. I'm choosing my father's life over my own freedom. There ain't no law against that. Is there? I am choosing. She held his gaze, and in that moment, Sutton saw her. He saw the unbreakable core of her, the steel spine that held her up while her father trembled and her farm collapsed. She was not a victim. She was a soldier making her last stand, using the only weapon she had left herself. They stared at each other across the small fire. It was a negotiation more profound than any he had ever conducted in a bank or a lawyer's office. Slowly, Sutton Hale reached out. He broke off a piece of the warm cornbread. It was heavy, dense, and gritty with meal, but it was warm. He brought it to his mouth and ate it. He did not say yes, he did not say no. He just ate the bread. Ilara watched him. She saw the acceptance, not of her offer, perhaps, but of the bargain itself, an acknowledgement, a truce, a vague, unspoken, and terrible agreement had been formed. She nodded once, a sharp, curt movement. She picked up the cloth the bread had been wrapped in and turned. The coffee pot is old, she said, her back to him. It's yours. Good night, Mr. Hale. She walked out of the light, disappearing into the darkness, leaving him alone with the fire and the second, heavier, offering. Sutton Hale did not sleep well that night. He sat for hours, staring into the dying embers. The piece of cornbread sat heavy in his stomach. In his coat, the legal papers, Deed 4187, felt different. The crisp ink and the sharp legal phrases were no longer a shield. They were a weapon, and he wasn't sure, anymore, which way it was pointing. The words on the page foreclosure, default, transfer, mineral rights had taken on a new weight. They were no longer just words. They were heavy as stone, heavy as a grave marker. The following morning, the sun did not rise. It wrestled. It fought the high, thin clouds, casting a weak, watery light over the basin. Sutton Hale had broken his cold camp at the survey line and was riding the perimeter, his mind still thick with the unresolved bargain. He was a man adrift from his own code. He found Ilara already at work. She was not packing. She was not weeping on the porch. She was mending the very fence he had ridden past yesterday. She was driving a new post, a piece of fresh-cut aspen, into the hard, cold ground. She was using a heavy wooden mallet, bringing it down with a rhythm of grunts. The work was too much for her. Her swings were short, her body trembling with the effort. But she did not stop. Sutton reined in his horse, watching her, He was at survey marker number 12, a 2-inch iron rod driven into the earth by a government man 5 years prior. It marked the precise, legal western boundary of the Quinn homestead. He watched her lift the heavy mallet, her back screaming in protest, and bring it down again. Thud, thud, thud. His eyes, trained by years of surveying and cavalry reconnaissance, immediately saw the discrepancy. She was driving the post on the wrong side of the marker. It wasn't a minor error. It was, he judged, a good 2 feet onto the land that now legally belonged to the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate. He sat his horse, saying nothing. He watched her work. This was not a mistake. A person digging a post hole in hard ground knows exactly where they are. This was a hopeless, desperate act of defiance. It was a silent, 2-foot claim staked against the authority of the entire United States government. It was her only no. He dismounted. The jingle of his spurs made her freeze. The mallet held mid-air. She turned, her face pale and damp with sweat, her eyes wide with the look of a creature caught nibbling a farmer's crop. She looked from his face, to the marker, to her post. Busted. "Ma'am," Sutton said, his voice quiet. He walked to the iron rod and tapped it with the toe of his boot. "The survey marker is here." He gestured to her post. "You're about 2 feet over the line. That's syndicate land you're digging in." Alara's shoulders slumped. All the fight went out of her. It was so much work wasted. The hard-packed earth, the cutting of the post. She waited for him to tell her to pull it up. Sutton looked at the post hole. He looked at her hands, wrapped in the same resin-stained bandages, now streaked with fresh dirt. He looked at her eyes, which were not defiant now, just profoundly tired. He thought of the law. He thought of the deed in his pocket. He thought of her impossible offer by the fire. He stepped back, breaking the tension. He gave a single, sharp nod. "That ground looks hard," he said. "You might want to use the creek water to soften it. Carry on." He turned, swung back into his saddle, and rode away before she could process what had happened. He had just watched her trespass, pointed it out, and then given her advice on how to do it better. He was now, officially, an accomplice. He rode hard for Larkspur Crossing, needing the distance. He needed to understand the people who had, in the span of 2 days, made him compromise a decade of professional integrity. The town was waking up. A single muddy street lined with false fronts. He bypassed the bank, bypassed the general store. He headed for the sound of steel on steel, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang that was the heartbeat of any frontier town. The smithy was a wide, open-fronted barn, black with soot and smelling of coal smoke and hot iron. A mountain of a man. His leather apron stiff with grime, was hammering a bright orange horseshoe into shape. "Mr. Crow?" Sutton asked, staying clear of the sparks. "The blacksmith, Bastion Crow. Didn't stop. Clang, clang, clang." He plunged the shoe into the slack tub, and a furious hiss of steam filled the air. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag. He was broad, bearded, with clear, intelligent eyes. "That's me. You're the syndicate man. Seen you right in." Crow said. His voice was a low rumble. "Just getting my bearings," Sutton said, leaning against a post. "Business out in the Copper Willow Basin, the Quinn parcel." Bastion Crow's massive shoulders tightened. He picked up a hoof rasp. "Ephraim's place." He started filing the cooled shoe. The sound a rough she. "Hard land." Sutton offered. "Good land," Crow corrected, not looking up. "Just needs a good hand. And Ephraim, his hands are shot. The sickness and his heart." He shook his head. "That bank. They knew he was sick. They knew his wife had passed. They gave him that loan anyway. Knew he'd default. It wasn't a loan. Mister, it was a trap. They wanted the mineral rights. You know them well." Crow finally stopped, resting the shoe on the anvil. "Know 'em, Ephraim and Abigail Quinn took my wife and me in during the drought of '84. We were holed up in a wagon, near starvation. They had damn near nothing, half a sack of flour, but Abigail, she'd bake a small loaf of charity bread every day. Said the Lord wouldn't let the flour run out if she was sharing it. I don't know about the Lord, but I know about the Quinns. We wouldn't have seen '85 without 'em. He gestured with the rasp. "And that girl Ilara, she's her mother's daughter, took it on herself to teach the letters to the kids at Sunday school. We ain't got a proper schoolhouse. See, so she'd bring her own books, dime novels mostly, and teach 'em to read under the cottonwood. Taught my own boy, Jacob, his name. She's the best of this valley. Mr. Hale. And that's the truth of it." Sutton was silent. A picture was forming, one of decency and quiet charity, and it made the deed in his pocket feel dirtier. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Crow," he said. "You ain't just here for my time," Bastian said, his eyes sharp. "You're the man with the paper. Just know you ain't just evicting a sick old man. You're evicting the folks who taught this town how to share." Sutton walked his horse down the muddy street, the blacksmith's words echoing in his head. He had a duty to perform, but that duty now felt like a betrayal. He was supposed to be in the business of law, not cruelty. He was so lost in thought, he almost missed the voice calling his name. "Mr. Hale, a word, if you please." Sutton stopped. Standing on the boardwalk in front of the Harrow County Bank was a man who was the complete opposite of Bastian Crow. Silas Kincaid was immaculate. He wore a dark wool suit, a starched white collar, and a silk tie. His hands were clean, his fingernails filed. He was the banker, and the primary partner in the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate. "Mr. Kincaid," Sutton said, touching the brim of his hat. "I received your wire last night. It was brief," Kincaid said, his voice smooth, but with an underlying chill. "It said you were assessing the boundary. I was under the impression the boundaries were quite clear. There was a matter with the occupant," Sutton said. "The occupant," Kincaid repeated, as if the word tasted bad. "Mr. Hale, my partners in Denver are not interested in matters. They are interested in commencement. We need that land cleared. I heard you spent the night in the basin. I trust you are not delaying." The implication was clear. Sutton felt a cold stiffness in his spine. "I am handling the transfer, Mr. Kincaid." "Good, because delays," Kincaid said, smiling faintly, "cost money, and my syndicate does not like to lose money." Kincaid gestured to a man leaning against the bank's window. Sutton hadn't noticed him. This man was Kincaid's opposite, too. He was all dust and menace. He wore a long, worn duster and a pair of revolvers strapped low and tied down. His eyes were flat and gray, and he was watching Sutton with the bored indifference of a wolf. "This is Mr. Brock Tolbert," Kincaid said. "He and a few of his associates are interested in the Copper Willow Basin as well. They'll be riding out to, shall we say, observe the transfer, ensure our assets are protected from squatters or complications." Tolbert pushed himself off the wall. He didn't smile. He just nodded at Sutton, a curt, dismissive gesture. Behind him, Sutton now saw 3 other hard-looking men were mounted on dark horses, waiting. An escort, a leash. "I see," Sutton said. "Noon tomorrow, Mr. Hale," Kincaid said, his smile all teeth. "I expect the deed filed and the land clear. No more delays." Sutton nodded, his jaw tight. He nudged his horse forward, riding past Tolbert and his 3 silent riders. He was no longer just an agent. He was a man being watched. He rode back to the basin, the weight of the day pressing on him. He was trapped between the decency of the Quinns and the cold ambition of Kincaid. When he got back to his camp at the survey line, the sun was setting. The air was turning sharp. He unsaddled his roan, rubbing the horse down, his thoughts bleak. And then he saw it. On the same flat rock where she had left the coffee pot, there was a small wooden bowl. It was filled with hot, steamed corn kernels, likely from their meager winter store. He stared at it. She was still feeding him. After he'd caught her trespassing, after he'd done nothing to save her, he picked up the bowl. The heat seeped into his cold hands. It was the simplest, most profound act of grace he had ever witnessed. It was not a bribe. It was who she was. She was Bastion Crow's charity bread. He ate the corn, and it tasted like ash. Later that night, under a full, cold moon, he walked to the Quinn property. He didn't go to the porch. He went to the woodpile, a place of silent transaction. He set down the coffee pot and the small wooden bowl, both of which he had scrubbed clean in the creek. He left them and I walked away, a silent thank you. The next day, he found himself drawn to the creek, Sparrow Run. He was telling himself he was checking the water rights Kincaid was so interested in, but he knew he was just watching. He was walking through a thicket of willow when he heard splashing. He froze. He parted the branches. It was Alara. She was down at the water's edge, kneeling on a flat stone. She was washing her hair. The water in Sparrow Run was barely above freezing, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks. He watched as she gathered her thick brown hair, plunged it into the icy stream with a sharp gasp, and then began scrubbing it with a harsh, yellow bar of lye soap. It was a picture of absolute poverty. She had no basin, no warm water from the stove, just the creek and a bar of soap that was probably strong enough to peel paint. A twig snapped under his boot. Her head shot up, her eyes, wide and terrified, met his. Her heart skipped a beat, a visible jump in her chest. She was trapped, her hair half foamed, her collar damp. It was a moment of pure, unguarded vulnerability. Sutton felt like an intruder. He should have turned. He should have made a noise, but he just stood there, his face revealing nothing. He didn't leer. He didn't smile. He just saw her. Alara held his gaze. He saw the flicker of shame, the panic, and then it was gone. Her chin came up. She held his gaze, and then, deliberately, slowly, she turned her back to him. She would not be shamed. She would not hide. She was a woman washing her hair, and he could damn well watch or walk away. She plunged her head back into the freezing water, her body shuddering from the cold, and began to rinse. Sutton was humbled. He turned, as quietly as he'd come, and walked away, leaving her to her pride in the icy water. He found her again an hour later. She was struggling with the lame mare, Juniper. She was trying to lead the horse across a shallow, rocky ford in the creek to get to a patch of better grass on the other side. But Juniper, her forelegs stiff and painful, refused to step into the fast-moving water. Alara was pulling, her thin arms braced, but the horse wouldn't budge. Sutton didn't ask permission. He walked up, his boots sinking into the mud. "Let me," he said, his voice low. He took the lead rope from her hand. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was rough and cold. His was calloused and warm from his gloves. It was an accidental, electric touch that made them both stiffen. Sutton didn't pull away. He simply adjusted his grip on the rope, his hand briefly covering hers. "Horse is favoring her left," he said. "All business. You pull. I'll get behind and push. On my count." Alara nodded, her face averted. He moved to the mare's flank, and Alara pulled on the rope. "Now," he said, giving the horse a firm, steady push. Together, they urged the reluctant animal through the water, stone by stone. They reached the other bank, and the mare immediately lowered her head, gratefully pulling at the sparse green shoots. They stood for a long moment, side by side, catching their breath, watching the horse. The tension of the morning, of the creek, was still between them. Alara broke the silence, her voice soft. She's all we have left. Pa, he traded our last good mule for her, thinking she just needed rest, but the leg never healed right." She looked at the creek. "The cold, it gets in the bones, it settles." She wrapped her arms around herself. "That's how my mother went. It wasn't a blizzard, like Pa says. It was the winter after. The cold just got into her chest. She coughed for 3 months. Tried to hide it from Pa. One morning she just didn't wake up. He blames the land. I just blame the cold." Sutton looked at the water. He understood. He knew what it was to be hunted by the cold. "Water," he said, his voice rough. "It can be a bridge, too." Alara looked at him, confused. He stared at the moving current, but he wasn't in Wyoming. He was back in Virginia. "The war," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. He never talked about the war. At the North Anna River, my company, we were pinned down, trapped against the riverbank. The Rebs held the bridge. They were just waiting for dawn to finish us. He picked up a stone, his fist closing around it. Me and a corporal, a kid from Ohio, we swam the river in the dark, just blackness and cold, with ropes. We stole one of their pontoon boats. We pulled that boat back and forth across the river, all night, 5 men at a time. The rope, it cut our hands to the bone. He looked at his gloved hand, the one that had touched hers. We got the whole company across, every man but one, the kid from Ohio, a stray shot. He never saw the other bank. He opened his hand and threw the stone into the creek. Plunk. That flimsy little boat, he whispered. It held. He had told her. He had given her a piece of himself, a piece he had never shown to another living soul. Alara was quiet. She was looking at his face. She was seeing the man, not the agent. She saw the thin white scar on his jaw, and for the first time, she understood it was a mark of survival, not aggression. The sun was just beginning to touch the top of Red Lark Ridge. The valley was filling with long, purple shadows. I have to see to Pa, Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. For his supper. Ma'am, Sutton replied. She turned and walked back toward the ford, her steps sure. He watched her go. They parted ways as the last light of the sun left the valley. They had made no promises. No bargains had been struck, but they were no longer two lines. They were two lines running parallel, and the ground between them was shrinking. The peace, such as it was, lasted less than 24 hours. It was broken not by a gunshot, but by a whisper. Alara found it at dawn. She had risen to check on Juniper, carrying a small measure of oats, and she saw it. A wide, ugly white scar running the length of their best patch of earth. It was salt, a thick, deliberate line of it, poured directly onto the tender bean sprouts they had coaxed from the cold ground. The young plants were already dead, their leaves blackened and shriveled, as if touched by a killing frost. It was a vile, cowardly act, a farmer's murder. Sutton rode up as she was kneeling in the dirt, her fingers sifting the corrosive white crystals. He saw the dead plants, and his face, which had softened in the past day, hardened back into the mask of the soldier. Who would? Alara's voice was a choked whisper. Who would do this? Sutton dismounted. He tasted the salt. It was coarse rock salt, the kind used for curing hides or for poisoning wells. This isn't a drifter. Alara, he said, his voice flat. This is an expert. This is Kincaid. This is his man, Tolbert. The salt was only the beginning. That night, the wind shifted, and it brought with it the smell of smoke. Not the clean, thin scent of their own chimney, but the greasy, acrid smell of burning pine resin. Sutton was out of his bedroll in an instant, his boots in his hands. He ran toward the glow. He found Alara on the western perimeter, the one she had been mending. She was beating at the flames with a wet saddle blanket, but it was hopeless. The fence line was on fire. Brock Tolbert, or his men, hadn't just set a fire. They had doused the posts with kerosene. The flames were high and hot, leaping from post to post, consuming the dry wood with a hungry roar. It was a message, written in fire, on the very boundary of the land. It's no use, Sutton yelled, pulling her back as a post collapsed in a shower of sparks. It's meant to burn. Get to the cabin. Make sure the sparks don't catch the roof. They stood there, helpless, watching 2 years of back-breaking labor turn to charcoal. The fire lit the basin with a sickening, dancing orange light, casting their 2 small figures into sharp relief. When the flames died down, hours later, the western fence was gone. Just a line of smoking, blackened stumps. Sutton walked the perimeter in the gray light of false dawn. He found what he was looking for. Pressed deep into the damp earth near the burned line, the tracks of a heavy wagon, and alongside them, the hoof prints of 4 horses. One set of prints was wrong. Distinctive. The left foreshoe had been set at a slight angle, canted to correct for a flaw in the horse's gait. Sutton had seen that kind of specialized shoeing in the army, but he had also seen it just yesterday, on the dark bay gelding tied outside the Harrow County Bank, Brock Tolbert's horse. He now had his proof. It was silent, and it was absolute. The combination of the salt and the fire was too much. The shock was a physical blow to the old man. When Sutton and Alara returned to the cabin, covered in soot and smelling of smoke, they found Ephraim slumped at the table, his breath a thin, ragged whistle. His face was a pale, bluish gray, his hand clutching his chest. "Pa!" Alara screamed, rushing to him. Can't breathe." He wheezed. "The smoke, my chest. Alara, get him to his bed," Sutton commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through her panic. "Loosen his collar. I'm riding for help." He didn't wait for a reply. He was on his roan in a single motion, spurring the horse hard toward Larkspur Crossing. He rode with the desperate, focused speed of a man carrying a dispatch from a losing battle. He returned 2 hours later, his horse lathered. He wasn't alone. He was followed by a woman on a sturdy mule. Marta Ellison was the town's closest thing to a doctor. She was a nurse, widowed by a mine collapse, and she knew more about frontier medicine than any $10 physician from the East. She was 40, with no-nonsense hands and eyes that had seen everything. She pushed past Sutton, took one look at Ephraim, and went to work. She listened to his chest, forced a few drops of a dark liquid digitalis between his blue lips, and set a kettle to steam. For an hour, she worked to stabilize him, Sutton and Alara watching from the doorway, feeling useless. Finally, she came out, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's resting," she said, her voice low. "His heart it's a worn-out leather strap. Mr. Hale, it's holding, but just barely." She turned to Alara. "The shock, the smoke, it's too much for him. He needs absolute quiet. No more stress. Do you understand me? Girl, no more." She looked from Alara to Sutton, her gaze sharp. "I mean it. Another shock like this, another fire, another fright, and it will be his last. You'll be calling the undertaker, not me." She packed her bag. "I'm leaving you 2 powders, one for the pain, one for the drops. Keep him warm, and keep the world off his shoulders." Sutton paid her from his own pocket. She nodded, her eyes lingering on him. "You're the syndicate man, ain't you? You got a strange way of doing business." She mounted her mule and rode off, leaving a new, heavier silence behind her. The stakes had been raised. They were no longer fighting for a farm. They were fighting for a heartbeat. Sutton rode back to town that afternoon. His anger was a cold, quiet thing. He left his horse with Bastion Crow, wordlessly handing him a coin. "She's pulling to the left," Sutton said. "I see it." Bastion grunted, picking up the hoof. "She's thrown a shoe. And this one," he said, tapping the canted shoe on Brock Tolbert's bay, which was tied up 2 stalls down. "Is a damn fool's job. Man who shod this horse was compensating for his own crooked eye, if you ask me." "Is he in town?" Sutton asked. Bastion jerked his head toward the saloon. "Where else him and his shadows? Been drinking since noon." Sutton walked into the Blue Badger. The saloon was dim, smelling of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. A few miners nursed glasses at the bar. In the back corner, at a round table, sat Brock Tolbert and his 3 men. They were loud, laughing, a bottle of whiskey between them. Sutton walked to the bar, ordered a beer he didn't want, and listened. "Told you, boys," Tolbert was saying, his voice a gravelly boast. "You apply the right pressure. Kincaid, he's all paper. Me, I like something you can taste, something you can smell." His men laughed. "That old man's patch of beans ain't gonna taste so good this year." One of them cackled. "Beans," Tolbert scoffed, pouring another drink. "Forget the beans. That fence line we lit up, that's just the start. That whole valley is rotten. All that dry timber, that soft soil. Wait till the next big rain. Without that fence line, without any roots to hold it, that whole upper shelf is gonna slide right down into the creek. The whole place will be gutted by the next rain. Nothing left but mud and minerals. He raised his glass. To the mud. Sutton paid for his beer and walked out. He had his confirmation. This wasn't just harassment. It was a deliberate, patient strategy of destruction. He walked up the street to the sheriff's office. He found another kind of pressure being applied. Sheriff Ada Cormack was behind her desk, a shotgun leaning against the wall behind her. She was a widow, like Marta, but where Marta healed. Ada held the line. Her face was weathered, and her eyes were the color of an axe head. She was reading a piece of paper, and she was not happy. "Mr. Hale," she said, not inviting him to sit. "You're Kincaid's man. Maybe you can explain this." She tossed the paper onto the desk. It was an anonymous complaint. "This is the third one this week," she said. "All anonymous, all claiming Ephraim Quinn is a squatter, that he's occupying land not his own, that he's a public nuisance. This stinks. Hale, it stinks of Kincaid's bank. He's not a squatter. Sheriff, he's a landowner." Or he was. He was. She agreed, her eyes narrowing. "And now he's a trespasser on his own property, according to your boss. And I've got Kincaid on one side, waving a deed, and half the town on the other, talking about how the Quinns saved them in '84. And now," she tapped the paper, "I got this. Legal pressure. Kincaid's trying to get me to do his dirty work, to ride out there and serve a warrant on a sick old man for squatting." "You're not going to?" Sutton said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said, surprising him. "I'm going to ride out, but I'm going to serve this notice." She picked up another, different paper. "This is a cease and desist. For Brock Tolbert, for arson, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment only," she said, her voice heavy with frustration. "I have no proof, just a whole town's worth of suspicion and a burned fence line. It's not enough to make it stick." "I saw his horse's tracks," Sutton said. "Canted shoe, left 4. Ada's eyes lit up, just for a second. "That's good. That's a start. But tracks ain't a witness. Hale, you find me a witness, and I'll pin that Tin Star wannabe to my jailhouse wall." Sutton left, his jaw set. He knew Kincaid was pulling strings. He just didn't realize how many. He was halfway to the bank when Kincaid's clerk found him. "Mr. Kincaid requests your presence." He found the banker in his plush office. The air was warm, smelling of cigar smoke and leather. "Hale," Kincaid said, not standing. He was smiling. "I'm glad you're here. It saves me the trouble of sending for you." He pushed a document across the polished desk. "This," he said, "is a lightning transfer contract, a new instrument, drawn up by our lawyers in Denver." Sutton didn't touch it. "What is it?" "It's a bonus, Mr. Hale, a significant one." Kincaid leaned forward. "I am tired of this charade, this pastoral drama. I want that land, and I want it now. I don't care about the old man. I don't care about his daughter. I want them gone, and I want that deed filed." He tapped the paper. "This contract offers you a cash payment, a very large one, double your commission. If you can deliver that property, cleared, within 48 hours. Sutton looked at the paper. He saw the numbers. It was more money than he'd made in a year. It was enough to buy his own land, to go anywhere. "And if I can't?" Sutton asked. Kincaid's smile vanished. "Then I will assume you are compromised, that you are no longer the effective agent I was assured you were, and I will send Mr. Tolbert to finish the job. And believe me, his methods are far less polite." The threat hung in the air, thick as the cigar smoke. This was the moment, the choice. Sutton Hale looked at the immaculate banker. He thought of the salt on the beans. He thought of the burning fence, the canted hoofprint. He thought of Ephraim's blue face and Marta Ellison's warning. He thought of Alara, her hands raw, washing her hair in a freezing creek. He picked up the contract. Kincaid smiled, thinking he had won. Sutton looked him right in the eye, and he tore the paper in half. He tore it again and again. He let the small white pieces flutter onto Kincaid's expensive rug. He leaned forward, placing his calloused hands on the polished desk. "Mr. Kincaid." he said, his voice a low, polite whisper. "I'm not finished here." He smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't touch his eyes. "I haven't even started." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Silas Kincaid sputtering in a cloud of his own smoke. Amidst the ruins of his contract, that night, a storm rolled in. Not rain, but a vicious, cold wind that tore at the canvas of Sutton's small tent. He was cleaning his Remington rifle by the light of a small lantern. The rhythmic, oily click of the cleaning rod was the only sound. The wind ripped the tent flap open, and a figure stumbled in, bringing a swirl of cold air. It was Alara. She was soaked. She wore no coat, only her thin dress and shawl. Her hair was wild, plastered to her face. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "Alara!" He was on his feet, grabbing his blanket and wrapping it around her. "What is it? Is it your father?" No, she stammered, her eyes wide with a terror that was deeper than the cold. He's asleep. It's the wagon." "What wagon?" "The wagon tracks," she cried, her voice breaking. "The ones from the fire. They came back. I heard the axle squeak. I looked out. They weren't at the fence. They were at the creek, upstream." She gripped the front of his shirt, her knuckles white. "Mister, Hale, they were dumping something. Barrels, in Sparrow Run, in our water. He's poisoning us. He's poisoning the water. He's killing us slowly." She finally broke. The weight of the salt, the fire, her father's sickness, and now this. It was too much. She collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs, a desperate, hopeless sound. Sutton held her. He held her against his chest, his arms strong around her, letting her cry. He just held her, his chin resting on the top of her damp hair, his eyes staring at the tent wall. He felt her terror. He felt her desperation. And in him, something that had been cold and hard for 10 years finally broke. The wall, the detachment. He held her until the sobs quieted into ragged, hitching breaths. He gently set her back, his hands on her shoulders. He looked into her red-rimmed, terrified eyes. He then turned to the small, makeshift table beside his cot. He picked up the heavy, blue steel Remington rifle. He slid the bolt back, checked the chamber, and then, deliberately, slowly, slid a brass cartridge into place. He pushed the bolt forward. The click of the action seating the round was the loudest, most final sound in the world. He laid the rifle on the table, between them. "No," he said, his voice quiet and more dangerous than any shout. He met her gaze. "Starting tomorrow, he will not touch this boundary line again. He will not touch your water. He will not touch you. I promise you that." And Alara, looking at his face, at the cold, quiet certainty in his eyes, and at the rifle on the table, finally, for the first time, believed him. Market day in Larkspur Crossing was a frantic, noisy affair. By noon, the single muddy street was clotted with wagons, mules, and people, farmers from the outer basins, miners in from their claims, and families from the small homesteads had all converged to trade, gossip, and buy the precious few supplies that made life possible. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, fresh bread from the bakery, and the ever-present, choking dust. Sutton Hale was not part of the chaos. He sat alone on the top step of the boardwalk in front of Weller's General Store. He was a still, gray point in a world of frantic motion. He had been there for an hour, his roan tied to the hitching post nearby, his gaze fixed on the doors of the Harrow County Bank. He was clean-shaven, his gray wool coat brushed, his hat pulled low. He looked less like a syndicate agent and more like a boulder that had been waiting 1,000 years for this specific moment. The chatter of the town quieted for a second, a ripple of silence that preceded their arrival. Silas Kincaid emerged from the bank, his dark suit immaculate, his face set in a look of profound annoyance. At his side, a half step behind, was Brock Tolbert. Tolbert was the picture of menace, his long duster failing to hide the tied-down revolvers at his hips. He was chewing tobacco, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's lazy arrogance. They began walking down the boardwalk. Kincaid intending to cross the street to the saloon. They passed the general store. Kincaid saw Sutton. The banker stopped, a cruel, satisfied smirk twisting his lips. He was looking at the man who had torn up his contract. "Mr. Hale," Kincaid said, his voice carrying over the street noise. "Still here, I assumed you'd be halfway to Cheyenne by now, having failed in your duties. Or perhaps," he gestured to the steps, "you're just a common vagrant now." Sutton did not reply. He rose from the steps. He didn't jump up. He didn't tense. He simply stood, unfolding to his full height in one smooth, deliberate motion. He was, as the outline said, like a post being driven into the earth. He was a barrier. He stood directly in Kincaid's path. "Get out of my way, Hale!" Kincaid snapped, his arrogance turning to anger. "You're done here, Kincaid," Sutton said. His voice was not loud, but it was so cold and flat that it cut through the market day din. "I am just beginning," Kincaid sneered, and he made the mistake of raising a hand to shove Sutton aside. The punch was not a wild, barroom swing. It was a cavalryman's jab, short, brutal, and perfectly timed. It traveled no more than 6 inches, propelled by Sutton's entire body weight. The sound was a sickening, wet thwack of knuckle on jawbone. Silas Kincaid's eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated shock. His feet left the boardwalk. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, and crashed directly into the open barrels of flour and beans stacked in front of the store. A massive cloud of white dust exploded into the air. Kincaid, the immaculate banker, disappeared into it, re-emerging a second later, sputtering, covered head to toe in flour, his nose bleeding. The street went dead silent. Then Brock Tolbert moved. He did not shout. He did not challenge. He was a professional. His hand blurred as it went inside his duster, coming out not with a gun, but with a long, thin skinning knife. He lunged, his body low, aiming for Sutton's gut. It was a fatal miscalculation. Tolbert was a barroom brawler. Sutton was a soldier. Sutton didn't step back, he stepped in. He moved inside the knife's arc, his left hand catching Tolbert's wrist in a grip of iron. His right hand clamped down on top of it, with a surge of leveraged strength. Sutton bent the man's wrist backward, a sharp, terrible torsion that went against the joint. A high-pitched scream of pain ripped from Tolbert's throat, his fingers unspasmed. The knife clattered onto the wooden boardwalk. Sutton did not release the hold. He spun, using Tolbert's own momentum, and slammed the gunman face first into the wall of the general store. Then he hit him. Once, a hard, calculated blow to the side of the head that sent Tolbert slumping to the ground. Dazed and clutching his broken wrist, the silence broke. The crowd, which had formed a tight, breathless circle, erupted. "Get him!" someone yelled. "My God, he hit the banker," another cried. Dust, now mixed with a haze of flour, rose from the street, hanging in the air like smoke from a battlefield. People were cheering, cursing, shoving for a better look. It was chaos. Sutton stood between the two fallen men, his chest heaving, his face a cold mask. He looked at Kincaid, who was trying to get up. Slipping in a mess of spilled pinto beans and flour. "That's enough, back away, all of you." The voice of Sheriff Ada Cormack was the sound of iron on iron. She pushed through the ring of onlookers, her double-barreled shotgun held low, its twin muzzles pointed at the ground between the men. "Sutton, back off, now!" Sutton raised his hand slowly, palms out, and took 2 steps back. Ada Cormack surveyed the scene. Kincaid, the white ghost, his face a mask of flour, blood, and fury. Tolbert, groaning on the ground, clutching his wrist. "Well," she said, a dry, dangerous humor in her voice, "this is a hell of a disturbance." She pulled a pair of iron cuffs from her belt and hauled Tolbert to his feet. "Brock Tolbert, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." "He broke my wrist," Tolbert howled. "Shouldn't have pulled a knife you couldn't hold," Ada said, ratcheting the cuff tight. She then turned to Kincaid. "You," Kincaid sputtered, brushing flour from his expensive suit. "Arrest this man. He attacked me. You all saw it. He attacked me." I saw a fight. Mr. Kincaid, Ada said, pulling a second pair of cuffs. And you, sir, are a participant. You can't arrest me, Kincaid shrieked. I can and I am, Ada said, grabbing his arm. Silas Kincaid, you and your hired man are under arrest for disturbing the peace affray. And let's see. She looked at the smoldering cigar that had fallen from Kincaid's pocket and was now lying near a kerosene barrel. Threat of public endangerment by fire. Now move! The crowd gasped, then broke into a low, rumbling laugh. The sheriff was cuffing the banker. As Ada marched her two prisoners toward the small jailhouse, the crowd parted, and in that gap, Sutton saw her. Ilara was standing by a wagon, the one that belonged to Bastion Crow. She wasn't crying. She wasn't running to him. She was just watching. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked on his. And in that look, he saw everything. She understood the promise he had made. She understood the violence he had just committed in her name. It was a look of terrible, profound, and unbreakable understanding. In the back of the wagon, propped up on sacks of feed and wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sat Ephraim Quinn. He looked thin as a wraith, his skin like old paper. He had seen it all. He watched Kincaid, the man who had legally stolen his life, being marched to jail in handcuffs, covered in flour. Ephraim looked at his daughter. Standing tall and steady on the street, he looked at Sutton, who was not in cuffs, who was just watching them. Slowly, Ephraim Quinn raised a hand to his daughter, and Sutton saw, clear as day, that the old man's hand was trembling just a little bit less. The jailhouse was small, hot, and smelled of stale sweat. It didn't take Kincaid long. He paid his own bail and Tolbert's in cash, his hands shaking with rage as he counted out the gold eagles. His left cheek was already swelling into a dark, ugly bruise. He stormed out of the office, stopping in front of Ada, who was filling out her ledger. Sutton was standing just outside the open door, waiting. "This is not over, Sheriff," Kincaid hissed, his voice raw. "You've made a powerful enemy today." "You won't be the first," Ada said, not looking up from her book. "And you." Kincaid spat, pointing a flour-caked finger at Sutton. "You're a dead man. You think this stops me. You think a punch stops the law. I will have that land. I will have it by paper, or I will have it by blood. That is a promise." Ada Cormack finally looked up. Her eyes were as sharp and cold as an axe head. "And you listen to me, Mr. Kincaid. You're right. I can't stop the deed you hold. Not yet. But you come near those people again, you send one more of your shadows to burn a fence or poison a creek, and I will forget all about the law. I will come to your bank. I will open every ledger you own. I will tear your mining syndicate apart, book by book, looking for one single, solitary, misplaced dime, and I will find it. That is my promise." Kincaid's face went white under the flour. She had hit him where he lived. He turned, wordless with fury, and stalked away, Tolbert cradling his broken wrist and hurrying behind him. Sutton turned to leave. The crowd from the market was still there, a cluster of farmers and townsfolk, including Bastion Crow. They were all looking at Sutton, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and a new, fragile hope. One of the farmers, a man whose land bordered Kincaid's other holdings, spoke up. "Mr. Hale, what you did, the law's on his side. He's still got the paper." Sutton stopped. He looked at the circle of weathered, worried faces. These were the people who lived by the land, and were being slowly bled to death by the paper. He turned to face them, his voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. "He's right. The law, it's just the frame. It's the wood and the nails. It doesn't care who lives inside." He paused, his gaze finding Ilara's across the street. "But justice," he said. "Justice is the house. It's the roof that keeps the rain off. It's the hearth that keeps you warm. The frame doesn't mean a damn thing if the house inside it is rotten. And we are the ones who build the house." A low, deep murmur of agreement rose from the men. It was the sound of a seed taking root in hard ground. They weren't just watching anymore. They were understanding. The law was Kincaid's weapon, but justice was theirs. The fight in town had not been an end. It was, Sutton knew, merely the end of the beginning. Kincaid was a coiled snake, humiliated and now more dangerous than ever. The punch had settled nothing. It had only drawn a clearer, darker line in the dirt. That night, the north wind came down from the high peaks, a physical, scouring presence. It was a true Wyoming gale, carrying the first cold, driving rain of the season. It wasn't a thunderstorm, but a low, miserable, soaking siege that found every crack and weakness in the valley. Sutton, in his small tent, listened to the canvas strain and pop. He was oiling the action of his Remington by lantern light, but his thoughts were on the Quinn cabin. The roof was old. The barn was worse. He pulled his boots on. He grabbed his hammer and a pouch of roofing nails he'd bought from Bastion. He didn't think about it. He just went. The wind nearly tore the lantern from his hand as he crossed the 50 yards to their barn. The sound of the wind was a high, thin scream. He found Alara already there, fighting a losing battle. She was on a rickety ladder inside the small, dark barn, trying to nail a loose board back into place. Juniper, the lame mare, whickered nervously in her stall. Rain was pouring through a gap in the roof, a solid, icy sheet that was flooding the main walkway. "Alara!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. She nearly fell off the ladder in surprise. She turned, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "Mister, Hale, the roof!" A crossbeam split. He could see it. A main support beam had cracked under the wind's assault, and the roof planks were peeling back. "Get down," he ordered, pushing past her. He slung his hammer onto his belt. "Hold the lantern. Keep it on the beam." He climbed the ladder, his movements economical and sure. He braced his shoulder against the leaking roof, taking the full, icy weight of the water. It soaked his gray wool coat in an instant, the cold seeping down to his skin. He didn't flinch. "Hold it steady," he grunted, positioning the new nail. He began to hammer. The sound was a counter-rhythm to the wind's howl. Thwack, thwack, thwack! He was reinforcing the cracked beam, driving long nails to support the break. It was a soldier's repair, brutal and effective. Alara stood at the base of the ladder, holding the lantern high. The amber light illuminated him, his face set in concentration, his hair plastered to his forehead. She watched the muscles in his back and shoulders strain with each blow. She watched his left shoulder, where the water was pouring over him, a sacrifice he was making without comment. He was, she realized, the first truly strong thing that had come into her life in years. He was the wall she had never had. He drove the last nail. The sound of the leak slowed from a pour to a steady, manageable drip. The beam was holding. He let out a long breath, resting his head against the wet wood for just a second. He was tired. She could see it. The fight in town, the ride, the tension, it was all there. He climbed down the ladder, his boots hitting the muddy floor. He was wringing water from the sleeve of his coat, his shoulders steaming in the cold. "That should hold through the night," he said, his voice rough. "In the morning, we'll need to brace it from the outside." "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was lost in the wind. He turned to pick up his tools. His hand, calloused and scraped from the work, rested on the ladder's rung. Alara reached out. It was not a thought, but an impulse, a need to connect. She laid her small, work-rough hand directly on top of his. Sutton froze. It was not the accidental brush of fingers on a rope. This was a deliberate, quiet, profound touch. Her hand was cold, but it felt, to him, like a brand. He didn't pull away. He didn't move. He just looked down at their hands, hers, pale and stained with resin, resting on his, dark and scarred. Their breath plumed in the cold, colliding in the air between them. They stood there for a long, silent moment. The world reduced to the sound of the wind, the dripping water, and the sudden, thunderous beat of their own hearts. Alara did not move her hand. Finally. Sutton turned his own hand over, his fingers curling slightly. A bare, gentle capture. "You're freezing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Go inside. See to your father. I'll check the mare." She nodded, unable to speak, and slipped her hand from his. She fled the barn, carrying the lantern, leaving him in the cold, roaring dark, the feeling of her skin still burning on his. She was in the kitchen when he came in 20 minutes later. The cabin's main room was dark, Ephraim breathing unevenly in his cot in the far corner. But the small kitchen was warm. The cast-iron stove was stoked, its belly glowing a deep, soft red. A pot of water steamed on its surface. Sutton stood in the doorway, dripping onto the floorboards. The wind howled outside, rattling the single window. "You'll catch your death," Alara said, her voice quiet. She didn't look at him, her hands busy with a tin mug. "I've had worse," he said, shrugging out of the soaked coat. He hung it on a peg by the door, where it began to drip a small puddle. He was left in his damp wool shirt. "You're your shoulder," she said, gesturing. "It's fine." "No, it's not." She came to him with a steaming mug. "Coffee? It's just chicory, but it's hot." He took it, his fingers wrapping around the warm tin. Their eyes met. The challenge of the barn, the starkness of the fight in town, it was all gone. All that was left was the two of them, trapped in a small, warm room. While the world tried to tear the night apart, the amber light from the open stove door was the only illumination. It painted the side of her face, catching the damp strands of her hair and the high curve of her cheekbone. It softened the harsh, worried lines around her eyes, making her look younger, more vulnerable. "He's asleep," she whispered, nodding toward the other room. "Marta's powder, I don't know if he'll wake up in the morning. He's a fighter," Sutton said, his voice low. "He's tired," she countered. She sank onto the long wooden bench that ran alongside the wall, near the stove. "He's just so tired of fighting." She looked into the fire. "I am, too." Sutton sat on the bench, a few feet away from her. The silence stretched, filled by the wind and the crackle of the fire. "I'm afraid," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. He waited. "I'm afraid of the silence. Pa, he snores. It's a terrible, rattling sound, but I listen for it. Every night. I'm afraid that one night I won't hear it." She pulled her shawl tighter. "I'm afraid of the white season, when the snow comes and buries the fences, and you can't tell the world from the sky. It feels like being erased, like God has just wiped the slate clean and forgotten you were ever here." She took a shaky breath. "And I'm afraid," she whispered, "of waking up and not hearing the chickens. It's a silly thing, but it means the food is gone. It means the foxes have won. It means it's over." She had just named the deepest, most primal fears of the frontier. Not the fear of gunmen, the fear of failure, the fear of oblivion. Sutton stared at his hands, wrapped around the mug. "I'm not afraid of the silence," he said, his voice thick. "I'm afraid of what comes after it. In the war, the silence was the worst part. The silence after the cannon stopped, when you had to stand up, when you had to count, see who was left." He looked at her, his eyes dark in the firelight. "I've been in that silence for 10 years, Alara, just counting, living in the after, until I rode into this valley. Now the cannon's firing again. And the strangest part is I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm afraid of it stopping." He had given her his own confession. He wasn't a man who wanted peace. He was a man who needed a reason. He set his mug down and began to unbutton the cuff of his shirt. What are you doing?" she asked, her voice small. "My glove," he said. He had been wearing his work gloves, and the left one was soaked and stiff. He'd forgotten to take it off. He peeled the wet leather from his hand. A long, raw scrape ran from his knuckle to his wrist. It was red and angry, beaded with blood. It was where he'd hit the wall, grazing it after he'd taken Tolbert down. "Oh," Alara breathed. "You're hurt." "It's a scratch." "No." She stood, moving with a sudden, new authority. She went to a small, carved wooden box on the mantel, her mother's box. She opened it and took out a small brown bottle and a clean strip of linen. This was my mother's," she said. "She made it from comfrey and willow bark. It's all I have." She came back to him. "Give me your hand." He didn't argue. He held out his hand. She knelt on the floor in front of him, the bottle in her hand. She was so close now. He could smell the faint, clean scent of lye soap on her skin and the sharp, herbal tang of the tincture. She poured a little of the dark liquid onto the linen. "This will sting." "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was tight. She took his wrist. Her touch was impossibly gentle. She began to clean the wound, her movements careful, practiced. The tincture did sting, a sharp, clean fire, but Sutton didn't move a muscle. He was watching her. Her head was bent, her thick eyelashes dark against her cheek. He saw the concentration in her face, the purse of her lips. She was mending him. She was mending the wound he had gotten for her. The wind screamed outside, but in the small kitchen, there was only the sound of their breathing and the soft daub of the linen. She finished, her hand still holding his wrist. She didn't let go. Slowly, she raised her head. Her face was inches from his. He could see the small freckles across her nose. He could see the deep, smoky blue of her eyes, no longer hollowed out with fear, but full of him. The distance between them was unbearable. It was a physical ache. "Elara," he whispered. It was a question and a warning. She didn't answer. She just leaned in. He met her halfway. He placed his free hand on the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her thick, damp hair. He leaned down, and she rose up. He touched his forehead to hers. They stayed there for a beat, just breathing. A moment of pure, agonizing stillness. A soldier finding his line, a homesteader finding her anchor. Then, slowly, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of two people stealing a moment. It was a kiss of profound, slow, and absolute certainty. It was deep, and it was unhurried. It was the sealing of the vow he had made with his fists, and the one she had made with her hand in the barn. Her eyelids fluttered shut, her lashes trembling against her cheek like a bird's wing in a storm. His hand moved from her hair to her back, resting in the small, strong curve. His palm flat against the thick, coarse canvas of her dress. It was not a caress. It was an act of possession. It was a statement. "You are here. I am holding you." Her hand, the one not holding the linen, came up. It didn't go to his shoulder. It went to his jaw. Her fingers traced the thin, white scar, a question she had never asked, and now didn't need to. Their bodies spoke the language they had been avoiding for days. It was a language of support, of refuge, of a shared and terrible burden, when he finally, reluctantly, lifted his head. They were both breathing as if they had run a mile. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He gently pulled her up from the floor, and she sat beside him on the bench. He didn't release her. He just held her. He pulled her against his side, his arm firmly around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, her body finally, completely, letting go. They sat there, listening to the rain hammer the roof. The wind howled, but it couldn't get in. They were sharing the warmth of the stove and the simple, profound warmth of each other. Their breathing, ragged at first, began to slow, to match, to sync. One steady rhythm. He felt her whisper before he heard it. The words, a vibration against his shirt. "I am not a trade. Sutton." It was the ghost of her first, desperate offer, a shame she had to exercise. His arm tightened around her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his eyes closed. "No," he said, his voice thick. "You're not. You're a choice." He reached for the old, patched wool blanket folded at the end of the bench. Ephraim's blanket. He shook it open and draped it over both of them, tucking it around her shoulders. They didn't move. They didn't speak again. There was no need. They just sat, sheltered, on a long bench in a small kitchen, sharing a single blanket outside. The Wyoming night did its worst, but inside, a silent commitment had been made, more binding than any piece of paper, stronger than any law. The night in the cabin had changed the air. The storm had passed, leaving the basin scoured, the sky a bruised purple at dawn. When Sutton Hale emerged from his small tent, the world felt different. The intimacy shared in the small, warm kitchen, the kiss that was both a promise and a declaration of war, had solidified his position. He was no longer an agent adrift. He was an anchor. He rowed to Larkspur Crossing not with the cold fury of the day before, but with the calculated precision of a surveyor. He was done with fists. It was time to use paper. He walked into the Harrow County Land Office, a place he knew well. The clerk, a thin man named Hobb, looked up, his eyes wide. He'd heard about the fight. "Mr. Hale, I assume you're here to file the syndicate's writ of possession." "No, Hobb," Sutton said, his voice quiet. He unrolled a piece of paper on the counter. It wasn't a deed. It was a map. A meticulous, hand-drawn survey of the Quinn homestead. "I'm filing a petition. And a claim." Hobb stared. "A claim against whom?" "Against the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate." The clerk paled. "On what grounds?" Sutton tapped the map. He had drawn a new line, bisecting the 160 acres. "I'm filing for a temporary parcel partition under the Territorial Use in Peace statute." Hobb's brow furrowed. The what?" "It's an old clause, rarely used," Sutton said, his voice smooth. "It was invoked in the Garnet Flats dispute, back in 1879. It allows for the preservation of a primary dwelling and subsistence acreage, the upper shelf, as they call it, in cases of contested title, pending a full hearing. Especially," he added, "when the contest involves duress and bad faith actions by the purchasing party." Bad faith. Which brings me to this. Sutton produced a second sheaf of papers. A formal declaration of damages. "You will file this with the county assessor and a copy with Sheriff Cormack." He laid out the evidence. A small cloth bag of coarse rock salt, identical to the sample he'd taken from the poisoned bean field. A piece of charred wood from the fence line. "I am filing a civil claim against the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate as the sole beneficiary of these acts. Destruction of crops, arson, reckless endangerment, and," he added, his voice dropping, "attempted contamination of a public waterway, Sparrow Run Creek. I want a full civil investigation into their holdings. I want their assets frozen, pending that investigation." Hobb was sweating. "Mr. Hale Kincaid, he'll have my job." "Kincaid," Sutton said, his eyes cold, "is a banker. I am a surveyor and a former agent. And I am telling you that this map is accurate, and this claim is legal. File it, or I will file a writ of mandamus against this office for failure to perform its duty." Hobb, trapped, snatched the papers and slammed the registry book onto the counter. The counterattack had begun. Across the street, Sheriff Ada Cormack was launching her own. She had Bastion Crow in her office. The big blacksmith held a heavy, dark object in his hands. It was the canted horseshoe he had pulled from Brock Tolbert's bay. "You're sure?" Ada asked, pen in hand. "Ma'am, I've been shoeing horses in this territory for 20 years, Bastion said, his voice a low rumble. "This ain't a correction. This is a mistake. The smith who did this was either drunk or blind. See how he filed the inside edge? It would make the horse favor that left foreleg, and it would leave a scrape right there." He pointed. "A scrape," Ada said. "That matches the tracks you and I found by that burned fence line." "To the letter," Bastion confirmed. "It's like a signature. Sheriff, that's Brock Tolbert's signature. Plain as day." "Good," Ada said. She took the shoe, tagging it as evidence. "Your testimony, Mr. Crow, just gave me what I need." She waited until Bastion left. Then she pulled a blank warrant application from her drawer. She wasn't just thinking about the fence. She was thinking about Alara's terror, the story of the barrels dumped in the creek. She began to write, addressing the warrant to the Kincaid Mineral Warehouse at the edge of town. She was looking for rock salt and kerosene. Sutton, meanwhile, was moving on to the third front, the hearts of the town. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the church. He found Pastor Reuben Slade sorting hymn books. The pastor was a young, earnest man. his face etched with worry. "Mr. Hale, I heard what you did. It was unchristian." "Was it?" Pastor Sutton asked. "I'm not here to talk about the fight. I'm here to talk about the harvest." He laid a single piece of paper on the pulpit. It was a petition. "Kincaid has the law, he has the deed, but we have the season. This petition simply asks the county court to stay the eviction. It cites Ephraim Quinn's health, and it asks just to let him stay until the first frost, to let him and his daughter reap what they have sown. It's an appeal to decency." Reuben Slade read the simple text. He thought of Alara teaching the children. He thought of the charity bread Bastian had told him about. Decency, the pastor mused. He picked up a pen and signed his name at the top. Sutton's next stop was Weller's General Store. Dinah Weller, the owner, was sweeping flour from the boardwalk, her face grim. "You cost me a 50-pound sack of flour. Hale," she snapped, though her eyes held a spark of admiration. "I'll work it off, Dinah," he said. "But first, I need you to sign this." She read the petition. "This is paper. Sutton. Kincaid will just tear it up. He can tear it up, but he can't tear up your signature, or Pastor Slade's, or Bastian's, or the 20 other farmers I'm going to see today. This isn't a legal document. Dinah, it's a wall. It's the town standing with them." Dinah Weller looked at the door of the bank across the street. She looked at the petition. She went inside, got her pen, and signed her name with a flourish. Kincaid's counterattack was swift and vicious. He couldn't use his fists. Sutton had proven that folly. He couldn't use his men. Ada was watching them. So he used whispers. By that afternoon, a new rumor was circulating the Blue Badger, spread by the barman Kincaid kept on his payroll. "Heard old man Quinn's desperate." The whisper went. "Selling his grain unripe. Selling his seed corn just to buy laudanum." It was a cruel, brilliant stroke. It painted Ephraim not as a victim, but as a failed, hopeless man, already liquidating, giving up. It was designed to break the community's newfound support. The whispers were followed by a hammer blow. A rider from the county seat delivered a legal notice to Sutton, who was still in town. Kincaid had pulled his strings. The court had received Sutton's petition, and it had received Kincaid's counter-injunction. The court, weighing both, issued a compromise, a final ultimatum: 5 days. Ephraim Quinn had 5 days to vacate the property, or Sheriff Cormack would be legally compelled to remove him by force. The fight for the harvest had become a fight for the weak. Alara did not hear the news with despair. She had spent the night after the storm processing what had happened. She had been offered as a trade. She had been saved. She had been kissed. She was no longer a victim. Waiting, she was a partner. While Sutton fought with paper, she would fight with the land. She took 2 split planks and a sheet of old canvas. With a bit of charcoal, she wrote a simple sign, "Quinn's Warm Bread, 2 cents." She built a small, crude stand at the edge of their property, where the main track to Larkspur Crossing passed. She took the small amount of cornmeal she had left and baked a dozen small, dense loaves of cornbread. She was not begging. She was selling. She was raising money, not to pay the bank, but to buy new seed. It was the ultimate act of defiance. It was a statement that, ultimatum or not, she intended to plant again. Sutton rode back from town with a 5-day notice in his pocket, his heart a cold stone. He saw her stand. He saw the proud, lonely sign. He saw her, shawl pulled tight, offering bread to a passing wagoner. He knew what he had to do. He rode to the general store. Alara, having sold her first 2 loaves, was there, counting out pennies for a small twist of salt. Sutton walked to the counter. Dinah Weller looked at him, her face sad. "I heard the news. Sutton, 5 days. "I need supplies," Sutton said, his voice flat. He pointed. 3 spools of barbed wire, 10 pounds of bean seed, and a new blade for that windmill." Dinah's face tightened. "Sutton, that's near $8. Your syndicate account is closed." "I know." Sutton reached into his waistcoat. He pulled out a heavy, silver pocket watch. It was old, intricate, the case worn smooth. "It was my father's," he said, placing it gently on the counter. "It keeps perfect time." Alara watched, her heart stopping. It was his last connection to the world he'd come from. Dinah looked at the watch, then at Sutton, then at Alara. She pushed the watch back. "Your credit is good here, Mr. Hale," she said quietly. "No," Sutton said. He pushed the watch forward again. "I'm not a man on credit. Dinah, I'm a man making a trade." He looked at Alara, his eyes holding hers. "My time belongs here now." He took the supplies and walked out. Alara followed, her heart too full to speak. That night, the land, which had been a place of poison and fire, became a place of hope. Sutton took his surveyor's tools and sighted a line from Sparrow Run Creek, above the spot where Tolbert's men had dumped their barrels. He was marking a thirst line, a path for a temporary irrigation ditch to the dry fields. He started to dig, alone, the work hard and slow in the rocky soil. An hour later, a shadow fell over him. It was Bastian Crow, a shovel on his shoulder. "Sheriff told me you were fighting paper." Bastian rumbled. "Figured you could still use a shovel." Behind him were 3 other men, young farmers, Bastian's apprentice. They were carrying lanterns, torches, and more shovels. "The pastor's petition got us talking," one of them said. 5 days ain't long, but it's long enough to get water to that field." The night came alive. Under the light of 6 torches, the men worked. The sound of shovels slicing into the earth, the grunt of men working together, the low murmur of voices. Ephraim Quinn, wrapped in his blanket, had insisted on being helped to the porch. Alara sat on the steps below him. They watched the distant, dancing lights. They looked like fireflies, a moving line of life in the darkness. They heard the faint, triumphant shout, and then the sound, the low, silver gurgle of water, moving where it had never moved before. Ephraim, who had not smiled in a month, felt his dry lips crack. A small, weak smile touched his face. He reached out a trembling hand, placing it on Alara's hair. "Listen," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle. She listened. She heard the water. She heard the men. "The land," Ephraim breathed. "It softens when it hears people." In Larkspur Crossing, Sheriff Ada Cormack, her evidence from Bastian and her warrant application in hand, went to the circuit judge's house. She was no longer just suspicious. She was certain. She knocked on the door, the signed warrant application in her hand. Ready to blow the Kincaid Mineral Syndicate wide open, the 5 days were ticking. Kincaid's response came on the 3rd day of the 5-day ultimatum. It did not come by paper. It came by fire. The wind had returned, a high, keening gale that scraped the valley, making the new irrigation ditch useless as it whipped the water into a fine, lost mist. Sutton was in his tent, cleaning the mud from his surveyor's tools. When he smelled it, it was not the clean, resinous scent of pine smoke from the cabin. It was the greasy, chemical smell of kerosene. He was out of the tent in an instant, his boots unlaced. He saw it. The barn. It was not just burning. It was exploding. Flames, whipped by the wind, were roaring from the open hayloft. A massive, swirling column of orange and black that punched a hole in the night sky. A scream, thin and terrible, cut through the wind. Alara. He sprinted toward the cabin, grabbing the axe he'd left by the woodpile. Alara was on the porch, frozen, her hands to her mouth. Ephraim was struggling in the doorway behind her. "Get him to the creek," Sutton roared, not breaking stride. "Get him clear of the sparks." He ran toward the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that singed his eyebrows. The entire northern half of the barn was a lost cause. The fire was moving fast toward the southern wall, where the seed and hay were stored, and where Juniper, the lame mare, was trapped. He could hear the horse, a high, terrified screaming that was almost human. "Sutton, behind you!" A wagon thundered into the yard. Bastian Crow at the reins, standing up and whipping his mules. Sheriff Ada Cormack sat beside him, her shotgun across her lap. "We saw the glow from the ridge," Ada yelled as the wagon skidded to a halt. Kincaid must have hired strangers. Bastian, the tools, Ada, the water buckets. Sutton took command. He was a soldier again. This was a siege. We can't save it. We have to aim it. We cut the roof, collapse it on itself. Bastian was already pulling axes and ropes from his wagon. It's a firebreak, I'm with you. Sutton scrambled onto the lower fence rail and, with a grunt, hauled himself onto the lower slope of the barn's unburned roof. Bastian, moving with a speed that defied his size, was right behind him. We cut here, Sutton shouted over the roar. They began to chop, their axes biting deep into the shingles. Sparks and burning embers rained down on them, catching on their clothes. Below, Ada and Alara, who had returned from settling her father, were dousing the side of the cabin, trying to keep it from catching. The wind shifted, and a wall of thick, choking smoke enveloped the roof. The mare! Alara shrieked, dropping her bucket. Juniper! Alara! No, it's too late! Sutton yelled, but she was already gone. She grabbed a wet blanket from Bastian's wagon, threw it over her head, and ran straight into the small side door of the burning barn. Damn it! Sutton roared. He started to climb down, but Bastian grabbed his arm. We cut the roof, or she dies in there anyway. Chop, man, chop! Sutton turned back, his heart a cold stone, and swung his axe with a desperate, savage fury. Inside, it was hell. The air was black, vibrating with heat. Juniper was mad with terror, kicking at the stall, her eyes rolling white. Juniper! Alara gasped, the smoke stealing her voice. She fumbled with the latch, the hot iron burning her hand. She ripped the gate open. The horse, blinded by panic, reared, striking the beam above. Alara didn't back away. She dropped the blanket and surged forward. Grabbing the horse's halter, she didn't pull. She did not try to force the terrified animal. Instead, she pressed her own forehead against the mare's wide, damp nose. Shh, she whispered, her own voice shaking, her lungs on fire. Shh, Juniper. It's just the light. It's just the wind. I am here. You are safe. I am here. She choked, her body racked with a cough, but she did not let go. She held her ground, her compassion a shield against the inferno, whispering to the horse, her own fear a secondary thing. Slowly, the mare's frantic trembling subsided. It dropped its head, its breath a ragged snort, and leaned into her. Now, Alara whispered. Now we go. She led the horse, step by step, out of the stall, through the smoke, and into the night. Just as a section of the hayloft above them collapsed in a shower of fire, they burst out into the orange-lit yard. They're on the roof, Ada shouted, pointing. Crack! The sound was not the fire. It was a rifle. A chip of wood exploded from the porch post, right where Alara had been standing moments before. Snipers! Bastian yelled from the roof. They're trying to pin us down. Sutton saw them, 3 dark figures on horseback, silhouetted on the low ridge, watching their work. Kincaid's new men. Ada Cormac did not hesitate. She dropped her bucket, snatched the shotgun from the wagon, and leveled it. She didn't aim at the men. She aimed into the dark sky just above their heads. Boom! The 12-gauge blast was a deafening, visceral answer. It ripped the night apart. This is Sheriff Cormac, she bellowed, her voice carrying an authority that dwarfed the rifle. Ride out of this basin, or the next one is for meat. The figures on the ridge paused. They had been paid to light a fire, not to fight the law. After a long second, they wheeled their horses and vanished into the darkness. Sutton and Bastian gave one final, desperate chop. The roof groaned. It's going, Sutton yelled. Jump! They leaped from the roof, rolling as they hit the muddy ground. The entire northern half of the barn folded in on itself, collapsing with a sound like a dying giant, sending a column of sparks high into the stars. It was done. The fire, starved of its path, began to die, hissing against the damp wood of the saved section. They stood there, the 4 of them, black with soot, chests heaving, in a circle of mud and ash. Half the barn was gone, but Juniper was safe, nuzzling Alara's shoulder. And Sutton, peering into the saved section, saw the scorched but intact bags of seed and the hay they had held. Dawn broke over a scene of devastation. The sun rose on a smoking, black skeleton. The smell of ash and wet charcoal was everywhere. Sutton, Ilara, and Bastian were moving the salvaged grain, their faces grim. When the buggy arrived, Silas Kincaid. He was clean, shaved, and wearing his Sunday suit. He pulled his buggy to a stop, his gaze taking in the ruin. He looked at the half-collapsed roof, the blackened ground, and the three people covered in soot. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips. "Beautiful," he said, his voice light. "The passion of the common folk, all this effort." He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "That's some very expensive, very cheap sentiment, Mr. Hale." Sutton stopped. He was holding a burnt piece of harness. He let it fall. He walked slowly toward the buggy, his boots silent in the ash. He stopped 10 feet away, his face a black mask of soot and cold fury. "This isn't cheap, Kincaid," Sutton said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "This is holding home, and you're done threatening it." "Am I?" Kincaid's smile widened. He was enjoying this. "I see a burned barn, I see a failed farm, and in 2 days, I see my deed. You have nothing. Mr. Kincaid." Ada Cormac's voice was sharp as an icicle. She rode up, not on her mule, but on a fresh horse. She was wearing her star. "You are correct, Mr. Hale," she said, ignoring Kincaid and speaking directly to Sutton. "He's done." She turned to the banker. "Silas Kincaid, I have here a warrant, signed by Judge Miller, to search your company warehouse." Kincaid's smile vanished. His face went white. "On what grounds?" "This is an outrage. On the grounds of conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, and the illegal dumping of hazardous materials in a public waterway." She held the paper out. "I'll take those keys, now." The Kincaid Mineral Warehouse was a large, windowless building by the empty cattle pens. Ada kicked the door open. Inside, it smelled of dust, machine oil, and money. Kincaid stood shaking with rage as Ada, Sutton, and Bastian fanned out. "There," Bastian said, pointing to a dark corner. It was all there. 20 sacks of coarse rock salt, stacked high, a dozen 5-gallon drums of kerosene, identical to the ones they'd found the remains of at the fence line. "That's not proof," Kincaid stammered. "I'm a merchant. I sell supplies." "Do you sell these?" Ada asked. She was standing by the wagon that was kept in the warehouse. She pointed to a long, iron-tipped pole, used for levering barrels. The end of it was caked in dark, alluvial mud, and it was covered in deep scratches. "We pulled a barrel from Sparrow Run this morning. Silas," Ada said, her voice deadly quiet. It was full of lye, and it was covered in scrape marks, marks that looked, to my eye, like they came from this very pole. Kincaid's composure broke. I don't, this is preposterous. "And we have this," Sutton said. He'd gone to the back, to the small tack room. He emerged holding a saddle. "Canted shoe on the left fore. This is Tolbert's rig. It's got no business in your warehouse." Kincaid looked from the pole, to the salt, to the saddle. He was trapped. The evidence was overwhelming. He did the only thing a man like him could. He pointed. "Him! It was Tolbert!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "That animal! I hired him for security. Not this. He did this. He acted alone. He must have—" Brock Tolbert, who had been standing in the shadows by the loading dock, his arm in a fresh sling, went pale. He had been set up. Now he was being sacrificed. He bolted. He spun and ran for the side door, the one that led to the alley. "He's running!" Sutton yelled. Ada drew her revolver. "Tolbert, stop!" Brock hit the door, threw it open, and ran headlong into Bastian Crow, who was standing on the other side like a brick wall. Brock bounced off the blacksmith's chest, stumbled, and tried to double back. He ran for the mouth of the alley, the old switchback. He rounded the corner and skidded to a stop. 2 farmers, the ones who had helped dig the irrigation ditch, were standing there. They were holding pitchforks, leveled at his chest. "Morning, Mr. Tolbert," one of them said. Brock turned. Sutton was blocking the other end of the alley. Ada Cormack walked up, her revolver steady. It was over. They returned to the warehouse. Brock was in cuffs. Kincaid was slumped against a stack of flour sacks, his face the color of ash. "It's done, Silas," Ada said. "With Tolbert's testimony, and believe me, he will testify to save his own skin. I can get an indictment for conspiracy. You will lose your bank. You will go to prison for a very, very long time." Kincaid's eyes darted around, looking for an exit. There was none. He was a banker. He had one move left, negotiation. "Wait," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Wait, Sheriff, Mr. Hale. We are all businessmen. This got out of hand." He looked at Sutton, his eyes pleading. "Silence. That's what you want, isn't it? I can buy your silence. I can buy his silence." He nodded at Tolbert. "Name a price. $10,000. 20. Enough to move. To start again. Anywhere. Just make this go away." Sutton looked at the bags of salt. He thought of the dead beans. He thought of the smoking ruin of the barn, and Ephraim's wheezing breath. "We don't want your money," Sutton said. "Then what?" Kincaid cried. "You can't win. The deed is still mine. The 5-day notice is still in effect. You've won nothing." "We want restitution," Sutton said, his voice cold. "You will pay for a new barn. You will pay for the seed you salted. You will pay for the fence you burned. And you will withdraw the writ of foreclosure." Kincaid stared. "The foreclosure never... That land, the mineral rights, that land is my future." "You won't have much of a future in a federal cell," Ada said, pulling a new set of cuffs from her belt. Kincaid was about to refuse, to call their bluff. "Sutton," Ilara's voice. She had followed them. She was standing in the doorway, her face streaked with soot, her eyes burning bright. She was not looking at Kincaid. She was looking at Sutton. Don't argue with him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He's a man of paper. He respects nothing else." She stepped into the warehouse. "If it's possible, get it by making him sign." Sutton's eyes lit up. He understood instantly. A verbal promise was air. A threat of indictment was leverage. But it wasn't a solution. But a contract written under these conditions, witnessed by the sheriff, was iron. He turned to Kincaid, a new, cold smile on his face. "Ilara is right," Sutton said. "You're not going to jail today. Kincaid, you're going to draft a new agreement." He pulled a crate over. "Sheriff, I believe you have a pen. Mr. Kincaid is about to sell me a piece of his land, and he's going to pay for the privilege of doing it." Kincaid looked at the jail-bound Tolbert. He looked at the iron pole. He looked at the sheriff, and he slumped in defeat. "Get me a piece of paper," he whispered. They did not use the courthouse. A legal proceeding, bound by Kincaid's bought and paid for procedures, would be a farce. This was a hearing of a different kind. They called it a court of the prairie. By mid-morning, the day after the fire, the town had gathered. They set up benches in the muddy yard in front of Pastor Reuben Slade's small white church. It was a place of moral authority. Standing in the shadow of the law, at a long trestle table, the judges sat. This was a tribunal of the valley's conscience. Sheriff Ada Cormack sat at one end, her shotgun leaning on the wall behind her, representing the law. Pastor Slade sat in the middle, representing God, and beside them, 5 landowners, Bastian Crow among them, representing the land itself. Silas Kincaid was given a chair. He sat alone, his face still bruised, his suit rumpled. He was a man surrounded, but he retained an air of cold, dismissive arrogance. This was not a binding court. It was, to him, an annoyance. Brock Tolbert stood behind him, his arm in a sling, flanked by 2 of Ada's deputies. Sutton Hale stood opposite them. He was not dressed as a lawyer. He was dressed as he had been for a week in his gray wool coat, his boots muddy, his face still smudged with soot from the fire. He was not an agent. He was a witness. On a small table beside him, He laid out his evidence. It was the physical story of Kincaid's war, a small cloth bag of coarse rock salt, a charred piece of fence post, a single, canted horseshoe, a long, iron-tipped pole, its end caked in drying mud from Sparrow Run, and, finally, the scorched but legible deed. Number 4187. We're here, Sutton began, his voice not loud, but carrying in the cold, still air. Because this document, he tapped the deed, was used not as a tool of law, but as a weapon. Mr. Kincaid bought this land. That is his right. But he did not buy the people on it. And when they refused to be broken, he tried to break them. He spoke clearly, without emotion. He was a surveyor, drawing a line. The law, he said, allows for a man to claim his property. It does not allow for the deliberate salting of another man's crops. He held up the bag of salt, then pointed to the pole. It does not allow for the poisoning of a public waterway. And it does not, his voice grew harder, allow for arson. He picked up the horseshoe. This shoe, he said, was pulled from Brock Tolbert's horse. It leaves a signature in the dirt, a signature found at the scene of the burned fence line, a signature found outside the Kincaid warehouse, where Mr. Tolbert was clearly hiding after his work was done. He built the case, piece by piece, the kerosene, the salt, the pole all found in Kincaid's locked warehouse. Connected to Tolbert. Who was connected to Kincaid? It was a chain of cause and effect, clear and simple as a hangman's noose. Kincaid wanted the land, Sutton concluded. When I refused to clear it, he sent Mr. Tolbert, and when he failed, he hired 3 more men to finish the job with fire. This wasn't a foreclosure. This was a siege. A low, angry murmur rolled through the assembled farmers. Kincaid merely steepled his fingers, his expression bored. Circumstantial, all of it. Mr. Tolbert was a regrettable hire, an overzealous employee. Nothing more. The fact remains the land is mine. The law is on my side. Then let me speak, Alara said. She stepped forward, and a hush fell. She was not the soot-stained, terrified woman from the night before. She had washed her face. She had braided her hair. She wore her mother's best dress, the patched canvas one. She held no paper. She held only herself. She did not weep. She did not plead. She spoke in the only language the valley truly respected, the language of sweat. Mr. Kincaid, he speaks of the land as 160 acres, as mineral rights, as paper. I speak of it as this. She held up her hands, palms out. They were raw, scarred, the nails broken. These are my rights, she said, her voice clear and strong. The bean field, Mr. Tolbert salted. That was 8 hours of planting, on my knees. With seed that cost me $1, I earned mending shirts. That's 2 days' work. Gone. Just gone. She turned to the 5 farmers. The fence he burned, that was 47 posts. My father and I, we cut them 2 years ago. It took us a week to haul them, to dig the holes, to set the wire. That's a week of our lives. Turned to ash. So Mr. Kincaid could prove a point. She looked at the assembly, at the women in the back. He talks about his deed. I talk about the 40 bales of hay we lost in that fire, the hay that was meant to get Juniper, our mare, through the winter. That is our winter. That is our survival. He didn't just burn a barn. He burned our time. He burned our food. He burned the hours God gave us. I am not here, she finished, her voice shaking but not breaking, to ask for pity. I am here to present a bill for the hours he stole, for the labor he destroyed, for the sweat we put in the ground, that he poisoned. She had not accused him of a crime. She had proven him a thief of a different order. And the farmers, who lived by that same ledger of labor, nodded in grim agreement. Then a chair scraped. Ephraim Quinn was pushing himself to his feet. Pa, no, Alara whispered, moving to help him. He waved her off, his hand trembling. But his eyes were the sharp, icy gray of a winter creek. He leaned on his hickory stick, his body a fragile, vibrating reed. Mr. Kincaid, Ephraim rasped, his voice thin but carrying. You said the law's on your side. It is, old man, Kincaid said, annoyed. Then let's talk about the law. Let's talk about the paper. Ephraim took a painful step forward. This all started with a loan. A loan for seed. After my Abigail, after she passed, I needed $500. He looked at the 5 landowners. You all know me. I pay my debts. But this debt, this one, I couldn't. He looked at Kincaid. Tell them why. Mr. Kincaid, tell them about the syndicate fee. Kincaid's arrogance shattered. His face went rigid. Tell them, Ephraim demanded, his voice rising. About the 40% origination fee you hid in the text. Tell them about the assessment charges you added. Tell them how my $500 loan became an $800 debt before I'd even bought the seed. You didn't give me a loan. Sir, you wrote a death sentence. You built the trap. You meant for me to fail. A collective gasp went up from the farmers. They all had loans at Kincaid's bank. They all suddenly, terribly, understood. They were not just witnesses. They were his next victims. The tide had not just turned. It had become a tidal wave. Bastian Crow stood up, his voice a low growl. We find that this is an offense, not just against the Quinns, but against all of us. The other landowners stood with him. This ain't justice, Kincaid, one of them said. This is just theft. Kincaid looked at their faces. He looked at Ada Cormack, who was watching him, her hand near her sidearm. He looked at Brock Tolbert, who was staring at him with the dead eyes of a man betrayed. He was ruined. His reputation, his bank, his future in Harrow County, it was all gone, burned to ash in a prairie courtroom. Sutton Hale stepped forward. He placed a new document on the table. It was a blank sheet, but he held a pen. You're right, Mr. Kincaid. Sutton said quietly, this isn't a legal court, so we're going to make it one. You have 2 choices. You can ride with Sheriff Cormack, who has a jail cell waiting for you and Mr. Tolbert. And I will present this same evidence, Ephraim's testimony included, to a circuit judge. Or you can sign a new agreement, right here, right now. You can make restitution. Kincaid stared at the paper. It was his only way out. What are the terms? He whispered. Sutton began to write, his hand firm. First, he said, restitution. You will pay in gold for the damages Alara Quinn just listed. The cost of the seed, the cost of the fence, the cost of the hay, the cost of a new barn. We've assessed it. The total is $67. A specific, humiliatingly small sum. The price of their sweat. Second, Sutton continued, you will sign over a new bill of sale for 20 new bags of bean seed and 10 tons of hay to be delivered from Weller's store at your expense by tomorrow. Third, he wrote, you will sign a legal, binding withdrawal of the foreclosure. Not a delay, a full withdrawal for 12 months, 1 full year, to give this family time to recover from the damage you have inflicted. Kincaid was nodding, his hands shaking. It was a steep price, but it was better than prison. And fourth, Sutton said, his voice hard, you will cede all water rights, not to the main creek, just to the small, secondary branch of Sparrow Run, the one you tried to poison. You will cede them permanently to the holder of the upper shelf parcel. Kincaid looked up, his eyes wide. The water rights were almost as valuable as the minerals. Sign it, Ada Cormack said, or I cuff you. Kincaid grabbed the pen. His signature was a jagged, angry black line. Ada, Pastor Slade, and all 5 landowners signed as witnesses. It was done. The aftermath was swift. Ada Cormack placed a heavy padlock on the Kincaid Mineral Warehouse. This building is sealed, she declared, posting a notice, pending a full investigation into safety violations and illegal storage of hazardous materials. Kincaid's mining operation was frozen indefinitely. Brock Tolbert, having testified against Kincaid in exchange for a lesser charge, was handed over to Bastian Crow. You're sentenced to 2 months of hard labor. Ada told him, you will report to Mr. Crow every morning. Your job. She pointed to the burned fence line. Is to rebuild every fence you helped burn. Not just for the Quinns, for the whole community. Bastian handed Tolbert a post-hole digger. You start now. Silas Kincaid, his face a gray mask of ruin, walked to his buggy. The town watched him in dead silence. He got in and rode away, not looking back. A man who had owned everything and was leaving with nothing. Alara did not watch him go. She was standing by the new irrigation ditch. The water, diverted from Sparrow Run, was flowing, dark and rich, into the dry earth. It was a thin, silver ribbon of hope. She knelt, dipping her hand into the cold, clean water. She looked at the land, at the promise of it. Sutton watched her. He had one last piece of paper to file. He went to the land office. Hobb, the clerk, was visibly shaking. Mr. Hale, what can I do for you? Sutton unrolled his final map, the one he had drawn in his tent. I'm filing a permanent parcel partition, Hobb, the original 160 acres. It's being split. Split, but Kincaid signed the withdrawal. Kincaid is irrelevant, Sutton said. He signed the full deed over to me, in exchange for my silence on the criminal charges, and now I am partitioning it. He tapped the map. This, he said. The lower bench, 20 acres. That parcel is for Sutton Hale. Hobb nodded, confused. This, Sutton's finger traced the main farm. The upper shelf, the cabin, the barn. And this, he tapped the stand of trees. Aspen Corner, the remaining 140 acres. You will draw up a new, clean deed. For Ephraim Quinn and Alara Quinn, free and clear. Sutton paid the filing fee with a silver $1. That night, the 5 landowners who had sat as judges met with him. You did a good thing. Hale, Bastian said. That fine, that's $67. We don't want it. The Quinns don't want it. It's blood money. So we had an idea. Pastor Slade said, we're starting a new fund. We're calling it the Clean Boundary Fund. And we're using that money to hire you, Mr. Hale, to be our valley surveyor, to map every one of our claims, to standardize the markers, to protect us all from the next Kincaid. Sutton looked at the men. He was no longer an agent. He was a neighbor. He nodded. I'd be honored. The moon was high and cold when he got back to the cabin. The smoke was gone, replaced by the smell of wet earth and pine. Ephraim was asleep, breathing more deeply than he had in a year. Alara was on the porch, wrapped in her mother's shawl, watching the stars. Sutton sat on the step beside her. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who had been through a war together. He's gone, she said quietly. He is, Sutton replied. And you're staying as our surveyor. I am. She turned to him. The lower bench, that's a good piece of land. It gets the morning sun. I know, he said. It's a good place to build a house. The silence returned, but it was charged now, full of unasked questions. Sutton stood up. He turned and faced her. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have pretty words. He had only the truth. He took her hand, her small, strong, resin-stained hand. He lifted it, not to his lips, but to his chest. He pressed her palm flat against his shirt, over his heart. He held it there, covering her hand with his own. Alara, he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. Feel that? She met his gaze, her eyes wide in the moonlight. She felt it, the steady, slow, powerful beat. Thump, 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 thump. Do you hear it? He asked. She nodded, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the soot on her cheek. It's so steady, she whispered. It wasn't, he said, his voice thick. For 10 years. It's been running too fast, or too slow. It's been the heart of a man waiting for the end. But now, he pressed her hand tighter. It's steady. You did that. You in this valley. You made it steady. He held her gaze. I'm building a house on the lower bench, Alara. But I don't want to build it alone. He didn't have to ask the question. She didn't have to say yes. She simply lifted her other hand, covering his, pressing her own hand even harder against his chest. as if to learn the rhythm of it. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder. It was a proposal and an acceptance, without a single vow. Under the cold Wyoming stars, the harvest returned to Copper Willow Basin. It returned not with a boom, but with the quiet, stubborn persistence of life itself. The new irrigation ditch, the thirst line that Sutton and the valley men had dug, carried the blessing of Sparrow Run Creek to the parched fields. The salted bean patch had been turned over, and the new seeds, bought with Sutton's father's watch, had taken root. By late summer, the climbing beans were thick on their poles, and the barley, golden and heavy-headed, bowed in the wind. The air, which had once smelled of smoke and fear, now carried the scent of curing hay and the rich, dusty aroma of happy sweat, the smell of labor given freely, for a purpose. The barn was new. Bastion Crow had organized the raising, a single-day affair of sweat, wood, and community. It was stronger than the old one, its beams set deep, a testament to what the valley could build when it stood together. Brock Tolbert, his arm healed but his face grim, had done his work. He had redug and reset every post on the western perimeter, his labor a silent, daily apology. When he finished, he rode out of the basin and was not seen again. Elara had changed. The hollow-eyed fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, confident light. She had taken the small canvas stand she'd built in desperation and made it permanent. Sutton, in the evenings, had taken a piece of clean, white aspen wood and carved a sign. His hands, though steady with a surveyor's tool, were not a craftsman's, but the letters were deep and clear. It read, "Willow Stop, Quinn's Warm Bread Reading Hour," by autumn. It was a fixture. Travelers on the Larkspur track would stop. Elara would sell them hot coffee, chicory and all, and a 2-cent piece of her dense, sweet cornbread. But the real payment was the reading hour. Under the canvas awning, a half-dozen children from the nearby homesteads would gather on rough-hewn benches. Elara, using the old dime novels she had once taught with, would sound out the letters. "B-A-R-N, she'd say. "Barn," a small boy shouted, pointing to the new structure. Elara's laugh, a sound that had been buried for years, was now heard often in the valley. It was clear and bright as the creek water. On the porch of the main cabin, Ephraim Quinn would sit, wrapped in a blanket. His color returned. His heart was still weak, but his spirit was mending. He would listen to the sound of the children, and a soft smile would touch his face. He'd pull a small harmonica from his pocket and play a low, reedy tune, his foot, once trembling with sickness, now tapping out a gentle rhythm on the porch boards. He was a man watching his own legacy return from the dead. The valley celebrated its first true Thanksgiving that November. It was a shared feast, held in the yard of the church. Sutton Hale, the valley's new official surveyor, sat not with the bachelors, but at the long table with Ephraim and Elara. He was, in all but name, family. The night after the feast, the air was sharp with the promise of winter. A hard frost silvered the ground. Elara, after seeing her father to his bed, wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders. She stepped off the porch and walked, not toward her own barn, but across the frosted field, toward the lower bench. Sutton's cabin was finished. He had built it himself, with Bastion's help. It was small, tight, and strong, made of pine he had cut and milled himself. It sat on the slight rise, overlooking the valley. She saw the light in the window, a single, warm, amber square against the vast blue-black of the night. She didn't knock. She just lifted the latch and stepped inside. He was there, sitting at a small table, a surveyor's map spread out under the lantern. He looked up, and his face, so often a mask of command or quiet intensity, softened in a way that was meant only for her. The cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the small stone hearth. Their shadows, cast by the single lantern, were long and dark on the pine walls. She unwrapped her shawl, letting it fall onto a chair. She was shaking, but not from the cold. He stood up. He didn't rush to her. He just waited. She crossed the small room. She stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the heat from his body. "Sutton," she whispered. He didn't speak. He just opened his arms. She stepped into them, and it was a homecoming. It was the end of a long, cold, terrible journey. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the clean, smoky scent of her. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her hands flat against the strong, hard muscles of his back, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. They stood like that for a full minute, just breathing, just holding. The wind whistled outside, but in the cabin, there was only the sound of the fire and two hearts, beating in the same, steady rhythm. He leaned back, his hands moving up to cup her face. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers in the lamplight. He saw the trust. He saw the love. He saw the woman who had faced him down with an offer of her own body, and who now stood before him, offering her soul. He kissed her. It was the kiss from the storm, but deeper, slower. It held all the promises of the night on the porch and all the certainty of the court of the prairie. It was a long, unhurried kiss that spoke of safety and of forever. Her fingers threaded up from his waist, lacing behind his neck, pulling him closer. His hands held her jaw, his thumbs stroking the high, sharp line of her cheekbones, their shadows on the wall. Two distinct forms, merged into one. When he finally lifted his head, he pressed his forehead to hers. Their breath mingled in the small space between them. "We're safe, Elara," he whispered, his voice thick. "It's over. We're safe." She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since her mother died. A single tear of release slid down her cheek. He kissed it away. He kept his arm around her waist, leading her to the wide, simple cot he had built into the wall. A thick wool blanket was folded on it. He sat, pulling her down beside him. They sat, side by side, leaning against the wall, his arms still heavy and warm around her. They didn't move. They just talked. They lay back, next to each other, on top of the blanket, their boots still on, the firelight playing over their faces. They talked until the moon was high, and then until it began to sink. They talked of small, wonderful, impossible things. "I'm going to plant apple trees," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "Along the ridge. At Aspen Corner, I saw a stand of wild ones. They could be grafted." "Apple trees," she murmured, her head resting on his shoulder. I haven't tasted a fresh apple in I don't know how long. We'll have so many. We'll be sick of them," he promised. "And children?" she said, her voice small. A secret she was finally allowing herself to speak. I want this valley to hear laughter. Real laughter. Not just coughing." He turned his head, kissing the top of her hair. "It will," he said. "It will." They fell into a comfortable silence. The fire was burning low, to red-orange embers. Elara sat up slightly. "Sutton," she said, "I have something for you." She reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth. She unfolded it. It was a man's handkerchief, made of fine, pale green linen. In one corner, a delicate, intricate piece of embroidery had been started, but not finished. A small, jade-colored willow leaf. "It was my mother's," Elara said, her voice thick. "It was the last thing she was working on. She was making it for my father, but she never finished." She looked at the threads, her fingers tracing the delicate stitches. "She told me, a long time ago, don't ever give your heart to a man just because he's loud, or rich, or strong. You give it," Elara's voice broke, "just once. She said, you give this to the man who keeps his dignity when no one is demanding it, the man who is decent just because he is." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the ember light. "I didn't have a dowry. Sutton, I didn't have anything to offer you but a trade. But my mother, she left me this." She pressed the folded, unfinished handkerchief into his large, scarred hand. He closed his fist around it. It was the most valuable thing he had ever held, more valuable than his father's watch, more valuable than any deed. He said nothing. He just pulled her to him, his kiss a silent, binding vow. The next morning, the sun was bright on the frost. The valley gathered at the land office. Sutton, as the new surveyor, had called the first meeting of the Clean Boundary Fund. He unrolled his last map. "This is the lower bench," he said, his voice clear. "My parcel, 20 acres. He took a pen. Hobb, the clerk, held out the new clean deed book. Sutton signed his name, and then he wrote beside it, "And Elara Quinn Hale." He turned to her, his face serious in the morning light. "I told the valley," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "that justice was the house we build. This is my foundation." He tapped her name. He looked at Bastian, at Ada, at all the assembled faces. "Kincaid," he said, "tried to take what he could. I'm keeping what I need." A cheer went up. The wedding was that afternoon. It was not a grand affair. It was held under the open sky, on the porch of the Quinn cabin, the place where Elara had first offered herself to him. Pastor Reuben Slade kept his words short. As the outline dictated, he spoke of the land and of finding a home not in the soil, but in another's heart. Sheriff Ada Cormack stood as Sutton's witness. She wore her star, but not her shotgun. When Pastor Slade said the final words, Sutton sawed a rare, genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. It was a short, unused expression, and it was beautiful. Bastian Crow, as Elara's witness, did not throw rice. As the couple turned, he reached into his apron and scattered a handful of new, shiny carpentry tacks. They landed on the porch, forming a rough, shining, heart-shaped outline at their feet. What is that for? Bastian?" Elara laughed. The big blacksmith grinned, his face red. "Old country magic, ma'am, iron. It wards off evil spirits and bankers." The final scene was not of the wedding. It was weeks later. The sun was afire, melting into the sharp, black line of Red Lark Ridge. The sky was a blaze of purple, orange, and deep, aching red. In the field on the lower bench, 2 figures moved in the twilight. They were not building, they were planting. Sutton held a woven basket, heavy with seed. Elara walked beside him, her hand dipping in, taking a small handful and dropping it into the dark, fertile earth. They moved in a slow, shared rhythm, a partnership. They reached the end of a row. Sutton set the basket down. He wrapped his arm around Elara's waist, pulling her close. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it were made to. They stood together, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her breath a small cloud in the cooling air. "The land? It's ours." "It is," he said, his voice a low rumble against her hair. She looked at the dark soil, at the cabin on the ridge, at the small, strong house on the bench. "This land," she whispered, her voice full of a deep, profound, and hard-won certainty. "It doesn't belong to the banks. It doesn't belong to the syndicates." She turned, pressing her face into his coat. "It belongs to the people who choose each other." Sutton kissed the top of her head. He said nothing. He just held her. And the wind, the cold, clean Wyoming wind, picked up her words. It carried them over the new fences, past the new barn, and across the wide, dark basin. It carried them beyond all paper and into the heart of the future. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.